Test, test, test. Okay. We have ignition, Houston.
Well, and we do have a select audience, second day of conference. I'm gonna give you a short intro, I think we should get you pretty close to it. All right. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, and welcome back to Amplify the Signal. I'm Jennifer Fallis from the University of Illinois, College of Media, Department of Journalism. I have enjoyed listening to your discussions in between sessions, after sessions, over meals. What I'm struck by is the range of audience we have here live. We have people who teach children, and we have people who speak to world leaders. And you also are, we're getting a little feedback, aren't we? We'll try that again. Thank you. So we have a range of audience as well. You know, some of you teach children, some of you speak to world leaders. And each of those audiences needs a different approach. And I've also heard you say, but I'm hearing conflicting advice. One speaker said this, the other speaker said this. And I tried that, but it didn't quite work for me. Exactly. We're always trying different approaches, needing different approaches, learning different approaches. And sometimes even our best intentions don't work out the way we had hoped or planned. And our first session is going to address some of the consequences of that. We're starting today with a nationally recognized expert on leadership and professionalism. Her work focuses on research integrity, on whistleblowing, ethics. C.K. Tina Gonzalez is the author of the Young Professional Survival Guide and the College Administrator's Survival Guide. She can speak to you on both ends of the spectrum. For many years at the University of Illinois, Tina was known for running the Department of Yucky Problems. In her role as Associate Provost, she was responsible for, among other things, training department heads, interpreting university policy. She oversaw problematic personnel cases, grievance procedures for harassment and discrimination. She has witnessed plenty of what we consider unintended negative consequences that are the result of what we call perverse incentives. As a licensed attorney, Tina has been on the faculty of the Colleges of Business, Law, Medicine. She served as special counsel to the Office of University Counsel for the University of Illinois, and she now directs the National Center for Professional and Research Ethics. She's a research professor at the Coordinated Science Lab in the College of Engineering, and that center's mission is to create and share resources to support the development of better ethics and leadership. Please welcome Professor C.K. Tina Gonzalez.
Test, test. Okay. Let's see if I jerked it out. Oh, this is on me, folks. This is all my fault. So much about getting here with dignity, huh? Okie doke. Now it feels loud. All right. So, one of the things I've appreciated about this conference is hearing from people with a range of different perspectives, and how gracious all of you have been about the different perspectives, because I'm bringing you another different perspective. I will say that I toned down, made a little bit more modest the title of my talk, because I'm not sure I'm going to tell you how to overcome the perverse incentives, although I have some ideas I want to plant in your brains. And before we get too far into this, I would just like to give a shout out to librarians, because in my quest to verify that things I was telling you were accurate, I discovered that my files were a little incomplete, and so I got in touch with the librarians at the university several times, and often a little bit later than one might have been ideal, and the librarians just rock here, folks. So just a shout out to the librarians. All right. So Jennifer was gracious enough to talk about the National Center for Professional and Research Ethics, and I want to focus on values-driven, effective leaders, institutional integrity, and intentional professional development. And that means intentional professional development at all levels, because in these large, complex, really great institutions, all of us play a role in institutional integrity, which means all of us need to think about how do we develop and what's our role in the institutional integrity and what do we play. I warned you that my background is a little different. I come from what I call the train wreck school of professional ethics, which has to do with problems that happen in organizations with very smart, very highly educated people. And I spent the first decades of my career doing that. And one of the things that I learned is that there are patterns to how really smart people in complicated organizations go wrong. And I have never met anybody that woke up and said, yeah, you know, today's the day that I think I'll screw it all up, mess up my career, shame my institution, make my family embarrassed, think about going to jail. Today's the day. It's just not how it happens. There's patterns to it. And so I've become increasingly more interested in prevention over time. And that's what brings me to this topic of perverse incentives and institutional integrity. I will say that a lot of you are scientists, and you probably need to know I'm a lawyer. I'm really sorry. I come from a family of biological scientists. They think that what I do is the waste of a pretty good genetic heritage. Um, Many of them still acknowledge me in public. They're really gracious folks. And in this train wreck school, one of the things that I think about a lot is the mission and role and purpose of our organizations. So I want to start with the fundamental question of why do we care about this stuff? Why do we care? Why are we spending all this time talking about the research and communicating it accurately? And my first cut at an answer is because we really want to have research that's rigorous, robust, reproducible, or, real, right? That's what we care about. And as I think about those things, and particularly the communicating with the public, I kept coming back to this quote. At the base of our investment in research lies the trust of the American people in the integrity of the scientific enterprise. If that trust is threatened, not only are people placed at potential risk, but the welfare of science itself is undermined. Now, this statement was made by a really obscure congressman at the time from Tennessee in 1981, in the very first hearings that Congress held on fraud in biomedical research. And what this really comes down to, and I think that a theme you'll see running through this, is about trust. And how do we deserve, how do we retain trust? And to do that, when you think about the integrity of science, one of the issues is, what are the core values that underpin the integrity of science? And I'd like you just to think for yourself and make a few notes right now of 2 or 3 of the core values that you think it takes to underpin the integrity of science. Not a rhetorical question. Just write it down, and then I'm going to ask you to compare your notes with your neighbor. What are 2 or 3 of the values that underpin the core values that are for the integrity of science? And then when you have a couple written down, share them with your neighbor. That would require talking to each other. And if you're live streaming, write it down and talk to somebody around you. Okay. All right. What'd you come up with? Shh. Let's hear what you came up with. Sing out, and I'll repeat it, because we're not going to try with microphones. Sing out, and I'll repeat it. What core values did you come up with when you thought about this? Honest, ethical. Honesty. Transparency. Accuracy. Curiosity. Evidence. Testable. Accessibility. Objectivity. Respect. Humility. Okay, so the reason that I ask this is because I'd like to ground us in that, and that I'd also like to say I spent some time serving on a committee where we spent a lot of time thinking about, the Committee on Responsible Science, thinking about the core values underpinning the integrity of science. And we ended up with this report, Fostering Integrity in Research. It's available online. It's free. I recommend it. It has a lot of stuff in it. I'm not going to talk about it. Did I mention it's free? And here are the values that that group came up with. And let's see how they match what you just talked about. Objectivity. Somebody mentioned that. Openness. Is that, well, whoever suggested transparency by openness with that? Accountability. Honesty. Fairness, I think I heard that. Stewardship. And this committee, did I mention that this report's available online and it's free? Has a lot of good stuff in it. We spent 5 years thinking about this. There's recommendations, there's a lot of important information in it about, there's resources for teaching responsible conduct of research. And one of the things I was really pleased to hear yesterday was at Young's talk, where he talked about who does science matters, because one of the things that our center on campus is doing is trying to help people have a broader concept of the integrity of science and how it's done, to include how do we interact with each other, What are our professional skills in teamwork and conflict resolution and inclusion, which means really having voice, not just sitting at the table, actually being heard at the table. How do we do that stuff better? Because if these are our core values and they're rooted in the mission and purpose of what these great research institutions are here to do, why am I here today talking to you about perverse incentives? What goes wrong and what can we do about it? So one of the things that the Committee on Responsible Science that produced this report, it's free, one of the most important things that this group did is tried to reframe this discussion in terms of thinking about the environment in which research is done. And we came up with this concept of the complex adaptive system. And there are a lot of players in this system. And I've been asked to talk about one element of this, which is the incentives and rewards. And to do that, I would like to frame a few things for you, because we all know what it should be, right? Paul Friedman was at UCSD. He passed away just a little bit ago. He wrote some of the best, most sensible stuff out there on these topics. And Paul said, faculty members should be rewarded for the quality of their work rather than for the length of their bibliographies. I listened online to a big symposium with a lot of big speakers not too long ago that were talking about trust in research and things like that. And one of the things that struck me is that at this pretty important national venue, international venue, every single speaker who was introduced with how many publications they had. I just think about that for a minute. Now, Paul wrote this in 1988, folks. So it's not like this is news, that this is an issue in our environment, that we should care more about quality than length of bibliographies. And then John Baylor, who was for a long time the statistical consultant for the New England Journal of Medicine, in 1995 noted that we all seem to be remarkably tolerant of deliberate deception in the selective reporting of data, as long as nobody is, like actually lying. And that's perverse too, folks. If what we care about is rigorous, reproducible, real. And we've been talking with each other about this stuff. It's not new, the statistical stuff. And I really liked Dan Simon's overview of that yesterday and some of the issues that happen. People have been noting these issues and some approaches to fix it for a long time. And it's not just that we've been talking to ourselves. There have been a lot of committees and a lot of shelf feed of reports talking to the public and making policy recommendations. This is just a selection. The page got kind of full. We've been talking about this stuff for a long time. So why are we still talking about it? What goes wrong? And I want to suggest some ideas and some approaches and the role that each of us plays in this. And I would also like to say that we're not just research institutions, we're educational institutions. And we perpetuate this system starting really early on, because students start in a lab and they learn how things are done, particularly if you want to keep your job, your stipend, your visa, your funding, stay on track. And so we perpetuate some of these things, because I'd like to note that if you're in a lab and even if what you're seeing is contrary to what you've been taught in maybe your responsible conduct of research or some compliance training that you've gotten, if what you're observing doesn't match that and it's winning, define winning, right? Which for some people is just surviving, we're going to keep perpetuating this stuff. So there's some perversity in the system, and we know it. And then if we come back and talk about the topic of this conference, which is about dissemination of knowledge, we encounter more perverse incentives. I'm going to play a clip in this next slide, which is from a panel sponsored by FASEB and held at the National Institutes of Health a year or two ago. And the person who's going to be speaking for the majority of the clip is Jocelyn Kaiser, who's a science reporter at Science Magazine.
Jocelyn, tell us your incentives when
Yeah,
you...
and they may be a little different from what scientists' incentives are. I mean, my job, I'm a news reporter, so my job is to produce news stories, and I want to produce stories that people will read. And unfortunately, sometimes that means things like sexy goldfish. I mean, your editor is going to make you change your story to make it as accessible as possible. And we are judged by, these days, by how many hits our stories get. We get weekly reports about which stories got the most hits. And sometimes those are important, in-depth science stories, but sometimes they're things like, having a cute animal story. And so, and sometimes as a reporter, it's a little confusing exactly what your employer wants. Do they want you to write cute animal stories or stories with sex in the headline because those get a lot of hits? Or do they want in-depth reporting on some basic research area that's important but hard to make accessible to the public? So,
How many reporters do we have in the room right now? How many of you have goals or incentives for hits and clicks and how much readership you get? All right, so that's for reporters. And now what we know is that for those outlets that do pick up press releases and have exaggeration in health-related stories, it actually starts in the academic press releases. And we know, remember the base of our investment in research is trust, 1 in 4 Americans think this is a big problem, and almost half think that it's at least a small problem that science researchers overstate the implications of their research. So go back to the roles that we all play in these institutions and institutional integrity. We all play a role. So if those are all the things that are there and they persist, one of the questions is, why? If we've been talking about this so long and we know what the source of some of the issues are. And the best explanation that I've ever found that I use for thinking about this when I think about it is also a little, it's been out there a little while. And it's an article by Steve Kerr, and it's called On the Folly of Rewarding A While Hoping for B. And it was published in 1995 in the business literature, The Virtue of Not Being Able to Hold a Job, which means that I've circulated around a lot of different colleges on campus. Reward systems that are fouled up in that the types of behavior rewarded are those which the rewarder is trying to discourage while the behavior desired is not being rewarded at all. Does that sound familiar? Publications are easier to demonstrate than teaching, and scoring baskets and hitting home runs are more readily observable than feeding teammates and advancing base runners. So there's a whole series of things. It's a short article. It's a classic. It's out there. It's easily Googleable. Search engines will find it for you. And he talks about follies, and I took the liberty of translating his approach to follies in research, where I took the values that the Committee on Responsible Science Fostering Integrity report is out there, it's free, and think about what do we hope for as opposed to what we reward. And that's on us, right? On all of us. It's not just the leaders. It's not just 1 or 2 people sitting over there in Swanland with their baskets of gold in the basement where they hoard it, try to hold it away from us. And why is all this happening? Well, people are complicated, and I'd like to thank both Dr. Cook and Dr. Simons for talking a little bit about some of the cognitive biases that infect our everyday interactions and what I call career tragedies. And Aaron Robinson and I have worked a lot on this. There's some other Robinsons at this university. Aaron is my particular favorite. And I think of career tragedies as the kinds of things that explain why what you don't know that gets us into trouble at work. Temptation, rationalization, ambition, group authority, pressure, entitlement, deception, incrementalism, embarrassment, stupid systems. And they all interact, and you don't always find every single one in every career tragedy, except they're there. And you'll notice that most of these are about internal feelings. Some of them are about external stuff. Pressure from the authority, peer pressure, stupid systems. We all work in stupid systems all the time. And they cost us sometimes, and at times you make compromises, and there's choices. We're all making individual choices all the time and laboring under cognitive biases to do that. So in science, John Baylor, one of my favorites, wrote in 1995, how many scientists have been tempted to clean up their data to tell a prettier story, perhaps by excluding observations that do not fit their expectations or remeasuring unsatisfactory observations until they come out right? Temptation. Then you can rationalize. I'll tell you what, folks, there's no scummy thing you ever want to do that you can't find a way to rationalize. And then you're working so hard and you feel entitled, and there's the ambition. You want to do well. You want to get the next paper. You want to get and so you say, well, I'm working so hard, I'm entitled. That's a red flag, by the way. If you ever start to feel entitled, do you know how that feels? That's a danger signal. And they all, and just you start incrementally. Incrementalism is really powerful in all this. So that's a science example. Here's an example in science communication. So think about a science writer at a university who's writing a release about a forthcoming faculty publication. Pressure from a faculty member who believes it's a breakthrough, even though it's a first study in mice with 8 subjects. And clicks or hits on what you put out there demonstrate your competence and skill in your reward system. And everyone else is doing it. So institutions can be part of the problem and should be part of the solution. And I want to stress again that institutions is all of us. It's not just somebody sitting over in some administration building. It's all of us, because these are very complex organizations in a complex adaptive system. And all of us interact on each other. And one of the things that science tells us is that the context in which we work really matters, because environments affect each of us, and we are part of the environment. Dan Ariely's research tells us that the amount of cheating in which human beings are willing to engage depends on the structure of our daily environment. And the structure of our daily environment reflects how do people react. So one of the best predictors of when undergraduate students will cheat is what the attitudes of the, and I like to think that undergraduates qualify as emerging adults, and that things that are true about undergraduates are also mostly true about adults. That's my bias. We know that the best predictor of whether undergraduates will cheat in classwork is the attitudes of their peer group. So if I come out of a test and say, ooh, I had all the answers on my calculator, and Kate says, oh, cool, you can be pretty sure in my peer group that there's a lot of cheating. If I come out and say that same thing and Kate says, ooh, I like to do it all I like to know if I know it. I like to have gone in figuring it out. That's a different environment. And in too many of our environments, the structure of our environment gives us really perverse incentives. And we are part of the problem and part of the solution. The leadership matters, and so does what we say to each other every day when issues come up. Because people are less likely to change if the observed practices are winning. So as we sort of slide into the hardest part of this talk, I would like to observe that if you ask the wrong question, you will almost always get the wrong answer. And so I would like to propose to you a concept that in a lot of the really fraught situations where there's difficult choices, there are some wrong questions and there are some better questions. So if you're a science communicator, how do we get this story out there? What the hook? What words will really sell this? How do we get this to go viral? Will that make the dean happier with us? Those might be a good place where you say, maybe I should ask some other questions along the way too. Here are some better questions I would suggest, and some of these were suggested by our other speakers in this, what have other studies in this area found? How are you anticipating the arguments of your critics? What time, money, effort will the next steps take? And this is a really interesting one, particularly in fields that have effect with biomedical research. Are you prepared to talk to individual patients about that, how this quote-unquote potential cure could affect them? Because if you talk to scientists, researchers, who have had things go viral about something they've done that's a potential cure for, one of the things that they talk about is the stress and time of the repeated calls they get from truly desperate people who are ill, who are afflicted with some physical ailment or mental ailment, and there's something out there that says potential cure, and hours on the telephone of a really emotionally stressful stuff talking to people who says, how can I get this? Are you prepared for that? And now I'm like to warn you, one of the things I used to teach was medical communication, and in medical communication, one of the things you do is give a warning shot before you give somebody some really hard news. So you say things like, maybe we could go sit down. Do you have somebody who could sit with us? Right? Now you're preparing people for some hard news. So this is the warning shot. I'd like to think, given what all I've said about perverse incentives and people are complicated, I'd like to ask you to think a little bit about a situation I think about a lot, which is, what about an institution dealing with significant research misconduct by a faculty member that's been verified and substantiated? Not way in the early stages. We have done the investigation. We're done. We found significant misconduct. Institutions have a natural desire to circle the wagon and minimize reputational damage. We are very prone to framing these things as the fault of one person, that one horrible bad apple. There wasn't any systemic failure here, nothing to see here, move along, move along. And we stonewall press inquiries, and FOIA requests get slow walked. If you've ever filed a FOIA request for something that's a little sensitive. And if you don't traffic in this area a lot, as I do, let me just give you a quick example of what I'm talking about. This is somebody who was found guilty of research misconduct, and this was the institutional statement issued by the institutional representative. We are pleased with the finding of research misconduct by the Federal Office of Research Integrity related to the work done by, I'm not trying to shame anybody particular. We trust that this will serve to fully absolve the clinicians and researchers who were unwittingly associated with his actions and bring closure to others who were affected. It was all his fault. Now, in the deposition related to this case, because I read a bunch of them, one of the questions to a colleague was, once you started digging, how long did it take you to find the manipulations that had been done in the data? It would take you about an hour, maybe. '83 co-authors. But I want you all to know they were unwittingly associated and fully absolved. There were 117 patients recruited to these clinical trials who were all, to qualify for the clinical trials, stage 4 terminal cancer. And in the course of this completely falsified research, they were subjected to invasive, painful tests that did nothing to help them other than cause suffering when they were dying. But all these other people, where it took maybe an hour if you looked at the data really carefully, they were completely resolved. I think this is really wrong, and I think we have to do better. And one of the reasons, if you go back and pick it out, is this theme about science is only as strong as its integrity. This is old too. Shout out to librarians for helping me find a better scan of this than the one I had. This was the USA Today in 1994. Here's a more typical version of a headline for that very same case. And if you think about emotions and human beings and how we react to things, betrayal is a really powerful feeling. And once you have been betrayed, your trust has been betrayed, it is really hard to regain the trust. And we have had a drumbeat of situations in which wrong questions and right questions have affected how our credibility and trustworthy as research institutions play out in the public. So when there's a problem, there are some wrong questions. How will this affect our reputation? How could one think Dr. X would do so-and-so? We don't have to report this, do we? And one of the worst things that it just makes my skin crawl and shames me is when a student or technician or person with low power says to me, what they said to me was, why would you want to cause trouble for your own research project? If we're research and educational institutions, and that's our mission, creating and disseminating knowledge, true stuff, we have to care about this stuff. And we have to think about wrong questions and right questions. So things that are better questions that I know for a fact because I have been in situations where they have completely reframed how people are reacting is, do we want our names and reputations associated with an institution where dishonest work is countenanced? Or is this a place where when something goes wrong, we address it, we respond to it, and we announce it? We had something that went wrong, we responded to it, here's what we did about it. Because you know what? That's not news. It's boring. Because everybody gets that people do wrong things. What's really interesting and where the news is if an organization comes together and conspires to cover it up. Are there other scholars depending on this work? We operate in a community of scholars that depends on trust of the work done by others to keep advancing knowledge. What kind of education are students getting at our institution? What are we teaching about how research is done? Those are questions that help us go back and reframe in those core values that you came up with and the mission and purpose of these organizations and what brought us into this in the first place. Whether you're a researcher or a communicator or somebody who just believes in the role these institutions play in our society. And there's actually research. This is just something I grabbed from last week about a study about when they disclosed and discuss errors, hospital mortality rates decline. This, in the British system, health service acute trusts or health systems, hospital systems. And the finding here is that empirical evidence, further evidence, to support further efforts to increase openness in the English hospital system, since doing so has improved health quality. So I'm going to just show you a quote now. I'm not even going to read it to you, and just ask you to think about it, because it dates from a recommendation from 1989. So if these are our core values, and if this is about trust and the welfare of science, I'm going to close with another quote from Paul Friedman, who really wrote some wonderful stuff in the 90s about research integrity that hasn't been surpassed. The argument that science must be regulating itself pretty well because it is making progress is far from compelling. Perhaps progress would be twice or 4 times as fast with greater scrupulosity. And we're all part of that. What questions do you ask when somebody brings you something? How framed in the values and the mission is your work? How often can you help people you work with who might be lost by the short-term concepts and perverse incentives? How often do you help people see the bigger picture? And so I want to leave plenty of time for questions, and I know that the stuff that I say is hard and sometimes not very welcome, and so I'm glad to argue with you about it. I will leave you with one thought. What are your actions saying about your priorities? And I would be glad to take questions. Back row has some questions. Maybe they're going to argue with me. You have a microphone. You go first.
Okie doke. This question, I don't know if it's on, relates more.
I can hear you.
Okay, good. To, I suppose, reporters and PIOs, of which I'm both. You'd mentioned that, we all play a role, and you went through the PIOs, the researchers, and reporters, but I wonder where there's room for the sort of the consumer of the news, the public. Is there any sort of indication that there's a role there as far as what people click on or what people are interested in reading?
The answer to that is probably, and I will tell you that I spend so much time thinking about our internal responsibility. One of the things that happens, I will say, when people come to see me about problems is that pretty regularly somebody will say to me, well, this whole problem would go away if that other jerk would change what he or she does. And I usually say in my warmest possible voice, you don't ever get to change what the other jerk does. We're responsible for us. Let's think about us first. And let's think about ways that if I change what I do, it'll ripple out in positive ways through the system. So the answer is probably, and I've never thought deeply about that because I'm so busy with what do I do and how do we as an organization do better and as part of a community of scholars.
I'm curious if you have any thoughts about how institutions can better handle cases of scientific misconduct at their institution. So in our field, there have been a number of these cases, but there have been a number of these sorts of cases at other universities. I'm sure there have been some here that I don't know about. But often the university that does the investigation, of course, as you say, has an incentive to not make waves about it. And there have been a couple of cases I know of where people have been exonerated, where I think if there were an external investigation, there's no chance they would have been. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about how institutions can go beyond their own institution investigating themselves.
Absolutely, and I've been writing about this. I went back and looked as I was getting ready for this talk. I wrote my first article about this in 1993, and I've had people suggest to me that, you know, I should reissue it and update it and things like that. So I read most of the stuff I wrote in the 90s about this. I wouldn't change any of it because I don't have new thoughts since I wrote stuff in 1993 and 1994 and 1995 and 1997. And, you know, the issues and the solutions and the address is the same. Have we improved? Yeah, we've gotten a little better. Have we improved enough? Not even. And it's really complicated because fundamentally with the problems like this, the organizations have to take responsibility for the investigation because the institution employs the people, enrolls the students, owns the building, receives the grant as the fiduciary for the grant funding, owns the equipment. So you have to do that. Are there some best practices in terms of should you always have an external member to help you avoid the groupthink? Absolutely. Should you have more rigor and should we have peer review, for example, of our investigation reports before they get released? If we believe that peer review helps strengthen the scientific and research literature, why aren't we peer reviewing our very fundamental stuff? And a lot of the really lousy reports, and I regret to tell you, I mean, there's some really great reports out there, and you don't hear about those because they did it well. The lousy reports, almost always you can sum up what they asked the wrong question, so they got the wrong answer. And it's hard. And let me tell you that every time I was ever responsible for one of these, managing one of these situations or running the process, I made some new, different mistake every time. They're really complicated, they're really hard. And it is possible to do better, and it is possible to learn from the experience of other institutions and do better. There are some best practices. And I think that we have to have the will and the resolve to adopt them.
Okay. Thanks for the talk. It was great. A number of us have been in the same space trying to help, let's say, increase the integrity of our local science. We've noticed, like your talk reinforced, that rational thought doesn't help, even with wonderful scientists. And so we're curious what type of structural changes can be made in the institution to foster integrity, because we're noticing that our thoughts and our arguments and our reports go for naught, and our departments and our units continue to reward flashy, provocative science that isn't reproducible.
Well, you know, there are a lot of ideas out there, and one of the issues is, you know, it's been a lot of years since some handful of institutions have started saying, instead of give us your whole bibliography for when you come up for promotion or tenure and awards, tell us what your 5 best papers are and why, right? Focus on the quality. I don't even know what our process is doing these days because I've been out of the Swanland for long enough. So there's some practices like that. We're putting a lot of energy right now into trying to redefine RCR, responsible conduct of research education, and think about it as professional responsible conduct that encompasses inclusion, encompasses conflict resolution, encompasses teamwork, encompasses a number of the other skills. I think that we have to just keep talking and keep raising this stuff. I think persistence matters a lot. I think we have to keep bringing it up, and I think reframing the questions in terms of the mission and the purpose and the values is sort of what has to be You know, one of the things that people talk about that leadership really makes a difference is when you have messaging themes and leaders repeat them over and over and over and over and over. I think all of us have to have messaging themes where we repeat over and over and over. These are the values. This is why we're talking about this. We're talking about integrity of our research and education. I don't think there's, I mean, if I had magic fairy dust to sprinkle with my magic wand, I promise you I would have done it. And I think that it's a lot of people in this complex adaptive system changing the questions that we ask and changing our reactions. And sometimes it's learning to speak up. Sometimes it's bystander training about a whole range of issues. Am I a part of the problem or solution, and am I going to have the courage, and can I recruit allies to support me when I do that? Hearts and minds matter, and persistence matters. I wish I had a better answer for you. You have the microphone.
Sure. Well, I mean, it's again related to all of these things, but you're probably familiar with the literature on institutional betrayal and institutional courage, like Jennifer Fried and other folks who do that work. I guess the thing that I keep getting tripped up on, I totally appreciate what you're saying about all the interpersonal stuff, and there's lots of us, right? Like we've worked on a lot of stuff to try to create at the level of the PI, the department head, like some of these levels, trying to transform people's incentives and reward structures. But if the upper administration is unmoved by that kind of stuff, so some of the broader systems and incentive structures are unmoved, like what do you think it's going to take to make those folks be a bit more courageous and show more institutional courage and start asking the right questions?
Well, I think we have to disaggregate. I don't think there is any upper administration. There are a lot of opinions and influence leaders in an institution like this. And a lot of really respected people in institutions talk to those folks all the time. Do we talk about these bigger issues, or are we always in there to say, I only need $42,000 worth of bridge funding? Or are we talking about, you know, so how much are we part of saying, I really worry about our larger systems, and then today, here's an issue I'd also like to talk about, right? How much are we keeping it there? How much is it at the forefront? So I think we're out of time. Thank you very much. I think I've got all my stuff. Sorry, can I let you through?
Wow. Thank you, Tina. And in the interest of repetition, while you're looking for her report, which is free, I will also remind you that her remarks are recorded and will be free on the Amplify the Signal website, as will all of the presentations, because our strong value in this two-day workshop is that everything will be used and continue to help all of you communicate in the future. Next up is Chris Fraley. He's a professor of psychology here at the University of Illinois. His research focuses on human attachments, the deep emotional bonds between people. He also studies how relationships develop, and he studies research methods. He teaches a research methods class on personality psychology. He teaches graduate courses on programming in PHP and R, significance testing, simulation methods. His current focus is what some people call the crisis of confidence in the social and behavioral sciences. In recent years, a number of findings have failed to hold up when independent labs tried to replicate the results. These include findings that have long been enshrined in textbooks and in the popular press. One of Chris's goals is to better understand how these replication problems came to be and what steps can be taken to minimize these problems in the future. Please welcome Professor Chris Fraley.
Good morning, everybody. So today what I want to do is discuss the concept of statistical power. Specifically, what is it and why does it matter to researchers and why does it matter to people who are communicating science to the public? Now, statistical power, unfortunately, is an abstract concept. Does anybody here play with power ideas or statistics more generally? It's kind of fun. So I want to kind of break it down with a concrete example just to sort of get us rolling. Now, I'm an instructor. I teach in the Department of Psychology, and like many of the people in this room who are teachers, there's probably one thing that drives you absolutely crazy. Is it this? I see my colleagues tweeting right now as I speak. Now, we have a lot of concerns about the role of devices and laptops and technology in the classroom more generally. One of our concerns, of course, is that students become automatons when they're trying to use their laptops to listen to us teach in classrooms. They begin to just type whatever it is that we're saying without fully processing it. Of course, another concern we might have is simply that they find their devices much more entertaining than us. And if you're kind of insecure like me, that makes you really uncomfortable, okay? But the truth of the matter is, we don't really know a whole heck of a lot about how the use of laptops or how the use of technology in classrooms may impact student learning. But this is the part where research methods becomes really cool. Because if you're a psychologist like me or somebody working in the social behavioral sciences, you say, aha, let's do an experiment. Let's get some students and we'll randomly assign, let's say 20 of them to use laptops or devices in classrooms. And then we'll have the remaining students not be allowed to use laptops or devices in classrooms. Okay? Maybe we'll have 20 students in each condition. And then at the end of the semester, what we will do is simply study people's grades. And we'll see whether those grades differ across these two groups. Okay? What a great way to find out whether this stuff really matters. Now, keep in mind, all this is sort of a mechanism to make the concept of statistical power more concrete. I don't want you to get caught up in the details of whether final grades are a good measure of student performance, things like that, okay? They come to me at the end of the semester saying it's the most important thing in the world, so I'm pretty sure it is. Now, let's say these are our results. We find out that the average grade for people who had devices throughout the course of the semester was about 70.2, let's say on a 1 to 100 scale. And in the no devices condition, it's closer to 71. Okay, so we would say that this is about a 0.8 difference. And just as an aside, in psychology and other social and behavioral sciences, we like to express this in a form called effect size metrics. So in other words, we take the difference of interest and express it relative to the variation in the scores. So in this case, we would say there's a Cohen's d of 0.08. One group is about 0.08 higher than the other. Now, this is interesting news, right? If you're concerned with whether the use of devices in the classroom might impair or facilitate learning, these data would seem to suggest that not having the devices would be a good thing. But for those of you who are in the sciences, you might know that we have to report a statistical significance test to draw any kind of conclusions from this that our colleagues will accept. And in this particular example, our p-value is not less than 0.05. So this is not a statistically significant difference. So what do we do in this situation? We have this joke in the social sciences. We bury this stuff. Nobody's going to be interested because we did not find a significant difference between the two groups, giving rise to what's called the file drawer problem. Now, here is the big question that confronts us when we're trying to understand what statistical power is. Namely, was the study capable of detecting a difference between these two groups if such a difference truly exists? Now, this is kind of a philosophical question in some ways, but we can address it statistically by playing a game. Now, I'm not good at equations, so anytime it comes to statistics, I start playing games. So this is how I confront these problems. Let's create a simulated world. Okay, we're going to have computational students who, in one group, have devices or laptops that they use in the classroom. And let's say because we're playing a game, we get to be God. We know what the truth of the matter is. And we're saying that in this condition, the actual performance is 70% at the end of the semester. Okay? That is a fact. Okay? That's the way we are creating this world. And we're going to have another condition where students do not have laptops or devices. And in this world, the average final grade is about 75%. If we go back to thinking about effect sizes or differences between groups, this is essentially a 0.5 difference in terms of Cohen's d. One group is half a standard deviation higher than the other. So this is the truth of the matter. But what we're going to do now is draw random groups of 20 from each of these two conditions and find the average final grade for students in those conditions. So we might pull out one group and find that the average final grade is 68%, and then in the no devices group, it's 74%. So a 5-point difference, Cohen's d, 0.56 or so, not a statistically significant difference. Now, here's the important part of our simulation or our game. We're going to do this over and over and over again, because what we want to do is get a sense of how often we would detect the difference using this particular research strategy. So if we pull out another group, we find a somewhat small difference, 0.11, not statistically significant. We do it again. This time, we find a difference of 0.68 between the two groups, okay? Having a laptop impairs performance relative to not having a laptop, statistically significant. And we can continue to play this game over and over and over again. In fact, when we play these games in our lab, we do this about 100,000 times. Okay? Does anybody want to go through all those results? No, okay. But here they are. The question we're asking here is how many of these 100,000 simulated results are statistically significant? Anybody want to take a wild guess as to what the answer is? That's correct, 34%. Sorry. Okay, so let's return to our original question. Was the study capable of actually detecting a difference if a difference truly exists between these two groups? The answer turns out to be is this study is capable of detecting that difference about 34% of the time. Now, this is the heart of what it means to discuss statistical power. Statistical power is defined as the long-term probability of detecting an effect if that effect truly exists. Okay, so when we translate this into our specific example, what we would say is the power of that study, where we have 20 people from this group and 20 people from this group, and we're comparing their average performance in a semester, is 34%. We'd expect that study to give us the correct answer 34% of the time. Now, although this is a fictitious example, I want to be clear that the outcome is designed to emulate what we know to be true about real research in the social and behavioral sciences. So this is a table that sort of estimates what the statistical power is of studies that are conducted in the social, behavioral, and medical sciences. Now, it turns out that for studies that have what we might call relatively small effect sizes, Brent Roberts is going to talk a little bit more today about exactly what that means. The typical power of those studies is about 15%, okay? So worse than our 34% example. For studies that truly have medium-ish effect sizes, so effect sizes comparable to a Cohen's d or half a point difference, the power tends to be about 50%, okay? And for studies where you're essentially trying to figure out if birds fly in the sky or walk on the ground, where the effect sizes are huge, we usually have no problem being able to detect whether those effects are real. Now that you know a little bit about what statistical power is, you can kind of wrap your head around it. I want to talk about reasons why statistical matters for researchers, why it matters for journalists, and why it matters for consumers of research. In particular, I'm going to talk about 3 different ideas. The first idea I want to discuss is that statistical power represents the fidelity of the study. That is, whether it is capable of getting the answer right. So when I say the statistical power of our laptop study is 34%, you can translate that in your head as saying, this study is only going to give us the correct answer 34% of the time. That's probably not a very good rate of success, depending on what your goals may be. Now, how many of you in here are actual researchers who have invested time in doing dissertations and things like that? Okay. Now, some of my students have designed really complex dissertations. We did some power calculations, and we found that the power of their study was about 40% or so. Now, why is that depressing? How many of you like to gamble? Brent Roberts, yeah, a few of you. I'm kind of intrigued by gambling too. I'm holding in my hand a quarter. I have a 50-50 chance of getting heads when I flip this coin. That means this coin is in a better position to give me an accurate answer to the research questions I'm asking than the typical study conducted in the social and behavioral sciences. Now, if you're interested in cost-saving measures, give every researcher a quarter and don't educate them about power, and everybody wins, okay? An important thing to understand is that power is critical to discovering the things that we want to discover. So if we're not calibrating our studies to have high power, then we're not doing the best kind of research we can to answer our questions. Now, there's another side of this that I think is important, and sometimes important in a sneaky way. We don't always just want to know whether something matters or not. Does using laptops impair or improve learning? We want to know how much. And it turns out that low-power designs can be insidious for dealing with this issue as well. Now, this is something that we call a sampling distribution in statistics. So if we go back to our original study design, this would capture all the different results we would get if we were to draw those samples over and over and over and over again from a population that really differs by a Cohen's d of 0.5. I've illustrated that by the dashed line here. Now, as you're aware, we can only typically publish things in the social and behavioral sciences if we get statistically significant findings, which means out of this sampling distribution, about 76% of what all the studies that could have been done wouldn't have been published. So what remains are the statistically significant findings. Now, what happens here turns out to be really interesting. What if we were to take the average effect size among all the findings that were statistically significant? That is, average all these Cohen's d's for the significant findings. We'd find that the average effect size is 0.87. Notice that it is considerably higher than the true effect size of 0.5. We would call this an M error or a magnitude error. Specifically, due to the low power of our study, we are inadvertently overestimating the quantity that we're trying to estimate accurately in the first place. And that's doubly a problem, given that we probably were unlikely to get a significant result to begin with. If we do get the result, we're going to overestimate the effect almost by definition. Another problem here, which is a little bit more subtle because I'm not that good at making graphs, is we are also vulnerable to sign errors. Okay? These are errors where the effect is in the wrong direction. So remember, we were playing God when we did that simulation. We know that one group is half a standard deviation higher than the other. But in 1% of the research findings that are statistically significant, we're going to have a result in the opposite direction. And notice that the average of those findings is huge, negative 0.65. So if you ever wonder why there are competing findings in the literature, in underpowered literatures, this is exactly what you might expect to find. Now, the good news here is each of these findings is minimized when statistical power is high. So here's the same kind of sampling distribution, but under a situation where instead of having 20 kids in each group, we have maybe 100 kids in each group. Notice that this distribution is much more compact. That is, on average, we're getting the effect size estimate more correct than we would in the other case. Notice also that if we average all the effect size estimates together, we'd get an answer, 0.52, that is very close to the truth. And notice that in this situation, there are no sign errors. There are no studies reporting a significant result in the opposite direction of the truth. So to summarize the first point here, if devices impair learning, we might not be able to detect that effect if we're using low-powered studies. If we do get a significant result, we will likely overestimate the magnitude of the effect. And if we do get a significant result, we will run the risk that the results will actually go in the opposite direction of what happens to be true. Okay? So the first big thing to understand about statistical power then is it impairs our ability to get the answer right when there's something real there to be discovered. Now, there's a second problem that I think is a little bit more subtle. If you've learned about statistical power in the past, part of what I've told you already should be familiar to you. What I'm about to tell you will probably rock your world. Because when I learned about it about 3 or 4 years ago, it completely changed the way I thought about research design. In introductory statistics classes, we typically learn that alpha, a value set to 0.05 or so, is essentially the type 1 error rate of the study, what we might call the false positive rate. So whenever we're doing research and we're using significance tests, there's always some chance we're going to get a significant result when we should not have, when there is no difference between the two groups, when what kind of device you're using doesn't matter, when the drug you're taking doesn't matter. And we typically control that by setting the alpha threshold to whatever type 1 error rate we desire, such as 5%, which is common in the social and behavioral sciences. Now, here's the thing that's tricky to consider. Is the false positive rate actually 5% in research literatures simply because any individual researcher sets his or her alpha value to 0.05? The sad truth here is that the answer is that the type 1 error rate, or the false positive error rate, can be much higher than 5% when researchers use underpowered studies. Now, let me give you again a sort of concrete or visual example of how this might work. Let's assume that we're dealing with a research area where there's 100 researchers doing 100 studies. So we have 100 studies altogether. And moreover, they're not all answering or addressing the same question. They may be all concerned with the role of technology in education and learning, but they're doing slightly different studies, testing slightly different hypotheses, et cetera. So let's assume that in this world, half of the hypotheses that researchers are testing are actually true, okay? And half of the hypotheses that researchers are testing are actually false, okay? So the way I'm illustrating this here is, let's assume that these reddish, pinkish boxes, which is a great way of imagining what a research study looks like, right? Okay, are false leads, okay? There is no difference between conditions in these studies. Whereas in the green case, there is an effect of technology on education or something like that. So there are real differences there to be detected, okay? Now, the important thing to understand is when we set our alpha rate to 5%, what that implies is that even when there's no difference between groups, occasionally we will detect one. We call that a false positive. And if we use an alpha threshold of 5%, that will happen 5% of the time. So in this box world, that means about 2 out of 50 or so, rounding down, will turn out to produce false positives, okay? We'll get a significant result when we should not have, okay? Now, false positives are undefined if there is actually an effect to be detected. So the question here becomes, among the studies where there is a true effect to be revealed, how often can we detect it? Let's go back to our original example. We'll assume that the power of these studies is 34%. So we expect 34% of the time we'll get a significant result when we should have. And in this particular example, that implies that about 17 out of every 50 studies or so will get a significant result. Notice that it's not all of them because our power is only 34%. Now, we put these two things together again, and we're going to combine it with a sort of computational sleight of the hand, if you will. It's called publication bias. We tend to only submit papers for publication if we get a significant result. Reviewers tend to only favorably evaluate the manuscripts if there's a significant finding there to celebrate. And typically, those things only get published and written about if there's a significant result. So let's take that to the extreme and drop out all the studies where there was no significant result. What that leaves us with are 2 studies that are false positives and 19 studies, or yeah, something like that, I can't do math, that are true hits. That means among this entire set of studies where a significant result was found, 11% of them, that is 2 out of this set, are false positives, not 5%. Okay? So in this literature, more generally, the false positive rate can be considerably higher than we might have assumed it to be. It's not just 5%. Here it's almost twice as much. Now, this is a problem for statistical power, because what happens if the studies instead had 80% power? Well, again, we're going to have 2 out of the 50 that are false hits, but among those, oops, sorry, I'm not good at animations. Among those that are highly powered, we're going to find that most, or at least 80% of them are statistically significant. So if we take this whole set of significant findings, now only 5% of them, roughly, are false positives, which is closer to our assumed type 1 error rate. Okay? So to summarize the key ideas here, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here. To summarize the key ideas here, the false positive rate in a collection of studies can turn out to be bigger than 5%. And power is absolutely critical to understanding how those false positive rates work. When statistical power of studies is high, the false positive rate in the literature is much closer to what we traditionally assume it to be, about 5%. But when researchers are consistently using underpowered designs in order to investigate the issues they're trying to investigate, not only are they likely to miss out on things, as we discussed previously, they're also likely to create a biased literature where much more of the findings are wrong than you might have expected, simply on the basis of the way you thought about significance testing previously. Okay, the third important thing to understand about statistical power has to do with the replication crisis, or the crisis of confidence in the social and behavioral sciences. As Jennifer mentioned at the beginning in my introduction, in the social and behavioral sciences, we're undergoing what some people have called a crisis of confidence at the moment. That is, there's a large number of studies that people have failed to be able to replicate. Studies that have been the foundation for certain areas of research, studies that have been publicized in the popular media and the foundation of trade books. Things that we thought were true basically have come to rest on a very shaky foundation. And this has made a lot of us wonder, what went wrong and what can we do differently to fix this problem? Now, there are many ways to go about fixing this problem, okay? But one of the things that we can do that is most immediately impactful is be concerned with statistical power. Statistical power is potentially one of the reasons why we're in this situation in the first place. Recall that statistical power is defined as the probability of getting a significant result if you should be getting a significant result, right? So if your studies are underpowered, that means it's unlikely that you're going to be able to get the result that you're looking for. Now, if you're working in your own lab, that's probably fine. You just keep trying over and over again until you get what you're looking for, right? But let's say another lab comes along and says, we want to replicate the finding that just came out in Nature. Well, if they're using the same underpowered design that you used to replicate it, then the probability of them getting a significant result in a 34% power design is only 34%. Chances are they're not going to be able to reproduce your findings. Now, I'm not really good at math, so I made this cheat sheet. Let's assume that actually your study is as well powered as a quarter, okay? You have a 50% chance of getting the right answer if, in fact, there is a right answer to be found. That is a difference between conditions. So the first time you do the study, you have a 50% chance of getting the effect. The second time you or somebody else does the study, you have a 50% chance of getting the effect. So what's the probability of getting two significant effects with a 50% power design? It's pretty low. It's only about 1 in 4. What if 3 people are trying to replicate a study? It gets closer to about 10 or 12%. And of course, if you're lucky enough to have 3 people want to replicate your studies, the chances that they'll be able to do so, all 4 of them will be able to do so successfully, is as small as about 6%. Low power multiplies out to create very small numbers, okay? Anything less than 1 multiplies out to 0 eventually. But when you're starting with a low number, you are absolutely guaranteed to have a crisis of confidence, because underpowered studies simply are not going to be able to be replicated. Okay? You were lucky enough to get the result in the first place. The chance that somebody else is going to get the same kind of luck becomes diminishingly small. Okay. Now, there's a colleague down the street at Purdue, Greg Francis, who has used this logic to do something that I think is absolutely fascinating. Namely, what he's argued is that if you look at a lot of the research literature in the social and behavioral sciences, what we tend to celebrate and what tends to be highly prized in publication outlets are what are called multi-study packages. So in my home field, social and personality psychology, a typical article doesn't just contain 1 research study. It might contain 4 to 6, depending on how ambitious the authors may be. So it appears that in that package of studies, you have robust, reliable, replicatable findings, right? 6 different studies, all showing the same thing, okay? But what if they are underpowered studies? I just showed you that it's virtually impossible to get 6 studies that all converge on the same answer if you're using underpowered studies. So Greg Francis cleverly devised a test that allows one to detect how often you should get a string of significant results that converge on a single answer, given the statistical power of the studies. One of the things that he finds by surveying the journal Psychological Science is that about 82% of the studies or articles published in that journal present findings that are more robust than can be expected given the low power the designs used. So there's a catch-22 here, namely, we know that low power is really bad for finding anything, much less replicating anything we find. And at the same time, some of the leading journals in our field are full of articles that purportedly reproduce and replicate everything that's been found. We know those things can't add up, and that contributes further to the crisis of confidence. So this is something important to consider when you're doing research or when you're evaluating research that you've been tasked with reporting on. Now, let me summarize the key ideas in this particular section. There are many factors that can contribute to replication failures. Nonetheless, in a field that uses underpowered designs, replication failures are essentially guaranteed. And the presence of multiple replications and underpowered designs can be indicative of publication bias and all kinds of things that might lead you to have a crisis of confidence. Now, I want to wrap up by discussing how can we go about designing well-powered studies, and how can you, maybe if you're a press officer or concerned with reporting on the literature, go about evaluating whether studies are adequately powered to report or provide us with reliable, robust information. Now, I'm going to nerd out just briefly, okay? Statistical power is considered to be a function of at least three things. One of the most critical things is what I called the alpha threshold previously, okay? We say that 5% of the time, maybe, we're willing to make a type 1 error. That is to reveal a significant effect when we should not have. That's something that the researcher typically clamps down, okay? But at least in psychology, everybody tends to use the threshold of 0.05 just to sort of keep things even. The second thing that matters greatly is the sample size, or the number of cases that are used, or colonies used in the research study in question. So as sample size increases in between subject designs, the statistical power of that design also increases. So this is what's commonly referred to as a power curve, and it shows how the statistical power of a statistical test varies as a function of the sample size used. And I've denoted on here the sample size of our original sort of laptop device study. Okay, if we have about 20 people per group with a Cohen's d of 0.5 and a sample size of 20 per group, our power is about 34%. Okay? But you can also see from this curve that if we were to increase the sample size, our statistical power would go up as well. So given that basic research design, we could, if we wanted our study to, let's say, be powered at 80%, that is an 80% chance of getting the answer right, if there's a real difference there, we could learn from this graph that we would need about 64 kids per group. Okay? That's not necessarily insurmountable, and having this information available to us can enable us to do better research design. Okay. Now, statistical power is also a function of what's called the actual effect size, or the population effect size. Now, Brent Roberts is going to talk about this a little bit in more depth later today, so I'm just going to brush over it really quickly. But what I want to say is that because statistical power depends on whether the effect size is, let's say, a half-point difference in your final grade, or a full-point difference, or a 10-point difference, clearly, the bigger the difference really is, the easier it is to detect it. Okay? So the way you think about power depends on how big you think that difference is. That is, what is a plausible effect size? The problem is, as researchers, we rarely know what the plausible effect size is. Okay? We're asking the research question typically because we're trying to answer that specific question. We might have some intuitions about how big it is, but part of the goal of the research is to estimate that quantity. Now, we can put some constraints on this. Oops, I'm running out of graphs here. There we go. Haha. Okay. There's one approach we can take here is to discuss what might be called plausible effect sizes. Okay, so in my field of social and personality psychology, based on people who do the hard work of summarizing studies of studies or meta-analyses, we know that a typical effect size is equivalent to a correlation of about 0.2 or Cohen's d of about 0.43. Okay? So we know that if people were just sort of reaching in randomly and studying some sort of research question, a good bet about what the effect size might be is a Cohen's d at 0.43. If we have that, if we're willing to use that as a working assumption, it tells us that, hey, we can use these power curves to make some guesses about what sample size we would need in order to have an adequate amount of power to design our studies well. Now, there is a caveat that goes along with this, namely because of the problem of publication bias and the magnitude errors that I told you about earlier. The things you see in the literature are almost guaranteed to be overestimates of what's really out there. So a good rule of thumb recommendation is to take something like this and cut it in half if you're designing your studies and you want to maximize the chances that you'll be able to reveal true things that exist. So, for example, we can use our power curves to sort of say, okay, if the population difference is actually comparable to a Cohen's d at 0.43, which again is the standard in personality and social psychology, I know that with an n of 20, the power of my design is 30%. Okay? But I can sort of go anywhere along this curve. I can sort of change the sample sizes, and I can get better estimates of what kind of power I would need, or what kind of sample size I would need to have a better statistical power. The second way we can solve this problem is to say, what is the minimal effect size of interest? Okay? So one way to think about this problem is we don't know what the difference is, let's say in educational outcomes, between kids who are using devices and kids who are not. But we might want to be able to say, I want to be able to at least detect anything of, let's say, a Cohen's d of 0.5 or higher. If you can at least answer that question, it provides you with some guidelines for thinking about how to design the study, or alternatively, what kinds of studies are worth reporting on. Okay, so let me summarize some of the key ideas here. Power is a function of three things. The first is alpha, and I've put here low control, because what I mean is that researchers don't have a lot of control over this. That's not technically true. There are debates about how to adjust alpha in ways that are systematic, precise, and useful. But for the most part, people take alpha off the shelf at 0.05 and use that. Okay? So it's not something that you as a researcher typically control. Sample size is a critical ingredient in statistical power. And I've said here that researchers have high control over that. What I mean is that if you're working, let's say, in the social and behavioral sciences, you have a choice of whether to recruit 20 kids per condition in your study or whether to recruit 100 or 200 kids per condition in your study. Yes, using more cases requires more resources, but if the trade-off is to increase the chances of getting the answer right or getting a better chance of getting the answer right, it could be a trade-off worth making. And of course, population effect size. I said here that people have low to moderate control over that. What I mean is that I can't control, as the researcher, how much of a difference there really is between kids who are using laptops in classrooms and kids who are not. But there are some things I can do to control the effect sizes I'm studying. So I can use good measures that minimize measurement error, or I can use sloppy measures. The sloppy measures are going to make my study more underpowered than it would be otherwise. Or if I'm uncomfortable with studying questions that maybe require me to use underpowered studies, I might choose to focus on different questions. So as a researcher, I can choose to study obvious things or more subtle things that require more cases or more consideration of statistical power. Okay, so let me wrap up. Statistical power refers to the ability of a study to detect effects that actually exist. When power is low, not only are studies unlikely to reveal the truth, they can actually lead to false positives, sometimes at alarmingly high rates. When debating what kinds of studies we should be publishing or doing, or what kinds of studies we should be covering in the popular press, in my opinion, it is imperative that we consider the statistical power of the studies being considered. So I have sort of a set of questions that I think we can ask when we are considering whether to promote a specific research finding or studies that are coming out of a specific university, a specific lab. I think one important question a journalist or press officer can ask an investigative team is, what is the sample size that was used in this research? Under the assumption that sample size matters greatly for the statistical power of the results of the studies being conducted. Given this sample size, you can also ask, is the research well designed to detect the kinds of effects that might be expected in this area? Okay? So if you were considering writing about a study that has an underpowered design, and either you suss this out yourself or you ask some statistical experts, one thing to keep in mind is that it's unlikely that the findings of this study will ever replicate. It's unlikely that they've actually been able to detect some of the things that might actually exist in the background. And it could be very well the case that some of the things that they have found are false positives, because low-powered studies are more likely to lead to false positives. Finally, you should probably also ask whether publication bias is a potential problem in that field. I naively assume that publication bias is a problem in all scientific disciplines, but I realize that I just kind of exist in the fourth floor of the psychology department and have a very narrow view of the world. So an important question to ask is it possible that only significant findings are being incentivized in this particular research literature? Because if that's true, then that doubles all the problems that we're discussing today. Thank you very much, and I think we have a little bit of time for questions.
Thank you for the really great explanation of power. As somebody who teaches power, I'm over here.
Ah, what's up?
But your entire...
I hear voices in my head. Okay.
Good thing you're in psychology. The entire argument is based on this P less than 0.05, which some of us have identified as being a perverse incentive. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if you could connect for people the relationship between power and things like precision and estimates that are outside of the realm of P less than 0.05 and statistical significance.
Yeah, that's a great discussion point. It's too bad that we're not drinking. Or have you been? Sorry. Okay, so there are two sides to that. Yes, I do think the whole, let's just call it a ritual. Let's be honest here. The ritual of significance testing has a lot of perverse incentives attached to it. When people, and students in particular, realize that they need P to be less than 0.05 in order to win or to get something that their professor will be impressed with, you create a system where students are motivated to get that particular outcome rather than get at the truth. And if the truth is something like laptops and devices don't impact student learning, we want to know that, right? We don't want to just know the things that work in the realm of significance testing. So the whole ritual itself creates all kinds of problems. It leads people to chase carrots when that's not really what they're supposed to be doing. Now, the concept of statistical power really only exists in the universe of significance testing. So it's part of this whole perverse incentives. It just happens to be the ignored part of it for the most part. But the key ideas play out even if you abandon significance testing. So for example, if we go back to our laptop example, one way we can frame the research question is less in a binary way. Do laptops matter? Do they impact student learning or not? We could say, to what extent does the use of technology in classrooms benefit or impair learning? We can turn it into a quantitative question. And then the answer there becomes that number that I'm showing you, Cohen's d, or whatever version of, whatever metric you choose to use. In that case, the same principles of statistical power apply. Namely, the larger the sample size, the more accurately you can estimate that quantity. So for example, the standard error gets smaller as the sample sizes increases. So the same principles still apply. Even if you were to abandon this ritual and say, you know what, P.05, that was for people growing up in the 90s. We are now an estimation generation. You still want to figure out what quantities are worth estimating and how you can estimate them well. And that requires careful attention to things about measurement and psychometrics, as well as sample size and how to minimize error.
I have one. I'm over here. This is an unfair question of you, and it may be that some people in the audience would want to say something, that some of the attendees. I'm a PIO, I'm a public information officer. I write about science, and I think that the starting assumption of most of us is it was published in a peer-reviewed journal. I'm not an expert. Should I be really should I care about, or should I take it on myself to evaluate a study and determine whether it's worth reporting on? Is it my job to do that, or can I just trust the scientific endeavor to do it for me so that it's published, I'm going to write about it, I'm going to amplify it?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, and I don't think I have a good answer to it, unfortunately. But let me give you at least 4 bad answers. Does that work? I think, so one of the big secrets in my area of psychology is that people go into psychology because they don't like statistics and mathematics or engineering. So what you're saying, I think, resonates with people who are publishing in the social and behavioral sciences, too. There's sort of a stats fear or phobia, if you will. So one of the things I recommended on that slide is you can ask the investigative team or the PIs or the researchers these questions. So you don't have to say, oh, God, here's a paper, I'm going to have to calculate the power of this, blah, blah, blah. You can ask the people doing the work. Chances are they don't know the answer either because of stats phobia. And I would take that as a cue. Namely, if the investigative team can't answer your questions about the statistical power of the research that they're doing, that should be a red flag that it might not be worth pursuing, unless, again, you're just looking for clicks or something. If you're trying to get at something that is worth sharing with the world because maybe it's reproducible and real and genuine, that's a red flag. Another option, I would say, is simply identify people you trust who can consult with you on these matters. So you're in a lucky position here because I've seen you email people like Dan Simons and say, Dan, what do you think of this garbage paper by Fraley? Should I report on it? And then Dan forgets to drop me off the email and says, no, that's garbage, low power. Okay. But you can identify people at your institutions or people you know well, contacts you trust, who have some degree of finesse, who you can turn to for these things. Having said that, I think there are also some simple rules of thumb that can be used. And I generally get worried when I'm thinking about rules of thumb because they're often misused or dangerous in some ways. But we have a simple rule of thumb in our own research group, which is in the study of individual differences, that is the differences between people. We might be looking at the differences between personality traits and life outcomes and things like that. We never design a study with fewer than 200 people, and we don't even read research articles that have ends fewer than 200. It's just not worth it. We got better things to do with our time. So you could adopt crude rules like that too, just as a way of weeding some things out. Sorry, that was 3 things, not 4 things.
There are circumstances where 200 subjects are not required for high power, correct?
That's true, right. Mm-hmm. So power is dependent both on alpha and sample size, but also how big is the effect actually to be detected. So if we're talking, if I was studying a research problem like, sorry, Game of Thrones has been on my mind all week. If I were to let a dragon loose in this room, would we have a higher incidence of burned people than non-burned people? You know, things like that. I think the effect size would probably be pretty big. And we wouldn't need a room full of 200 people to figure out whether that association exists. Yeah, it turns out when there's not a dragon in the room, people remain unscarred, but Daenerys, Dracarys, things like that. So there are some problems in science where the effect sizes are relatively big, and you don't need 200 cases to observe them. Now, I think it's tricky to understand where those situations exist. I have a weird way of thinking about the world, which is I think there are some problems that are really interesting to study because we are blind to the truth. So I don't know much about astronomy, for example. But I assume that there are things out there that I cannot see because I do not have a powerful enough telescope. But that doesn't mean that those planets are small in magnitude or anything like that. I just don't have the right tools. Give me the right tool, and I should be able to observe it, and anybody else should be able to observe it too. The problem is, in my area where we're dealing with human behavior and human emotions, we're all witnessing this stuff on a day-to-day basis. The low-hanging fruit have already been picked. So what we have left to study, to refine, are the things that are more subtle. That means it's not going to be as big as dragon flies into a room, the town dies, right? It's going to be more, 10 minutes left? Okay, I'll stop with the dragon tales. Okay. There are going to be more subtle things, which require more powerful microscopes. We need larger sample sizes to detect those more subtle effects. If we're thinking about something as complex as educational outcomes, how kids perform in a class, it's not just a matter of whether they're using a laptop or not. There's probably 100 different things contributing to that, which necessarily makes the signal relatively weak. You need a way to sort of amplify it. So yes, I'll just say this is a rule. That's one of the dangers of rules of thumb. Right. Yes.
Okay. I was wondering if in social psychology or psychology, are the funding rates for studies commensurate with the number of samples you actually need? Because this is an issue we face a lot, I think, in science in general, is that the grants are too small. You have to promise more than you could ever afford to do to get it, right? And then you say, okay, well, I'll just get done what I can. And I'm wondering if there's this, if you guys feel this crunch as well.
So I'm not sure if I fully understood the question. Can you ask it just one more time in a slightly different way, maybe? When you said funding, I got all excited and distracted.
Yeah, right. Do you get enough money to do sample sizes that are big enough to be meaningful?
So I'll just speak from my own experience serving on certain grant panels. I would say, yes, it's possible to get the money you need. Not necessarily, let's say, to follow people across their entire life courses, but to do meaningful research. And I would say also, at least at the National Science Foundation and the social and economic areas, there is more attention on statistical power these days than there was in the past. There's always been lip service to it, but now people are thinking more critically about the proposals. Is this proposal asking a good question? Is it proposing a study design that's capable of providing an appropriate answer? And emphasizing that in a way that I haven't seen people emphasize in the past. So I find that kind of exciting.
I'm wondering whether modeling would help amplify the power that we get from probably a smaller sample size. What do you feel about that?
Modeling?
Yes, computer modeling, and now with more artificial intelligence, we are like amplifying the little data that we have.
Yeah, that's a good question. The question is, can we use computational modeling to sort of amplify the signal in some of these low power situations? And I think there might be ways to do that. Part of the problem is I'm not clever enough to be able to say how to do that. And because I think I'm an empiricist at heart, I'm always thinking the best solution to this problem is more data rather than more modeling. But I think sometimes if you could start off by modeling the problem, it would provide you with some better constraints on what you might expect to find. And that could be used to guide how you go about designing your research. Because if you're just casting a wide net, that's using a lot of resources in a relatively blind way. But if you can cast that net in a very specific way that might be informed by some sort of computational or mathematical model, that could be a real benefit to the lab, the field, et cetera.
So you mentioned earlier meta-analyses, and I've been noticing more and more of those being published. And as someone who has a strong enough background in stats to analyze my own data, but not something as complicated as a meta-analysis, would you be willing to talk about how you personally look at those to see if you think they're done well or if they're falling into sort of some of the similar traps that you've been talking about?
Okay, so Brent, can I ask you a quick question? Are you talking about meta-analysis later today? No, dang, I was going to dodge that question. Okay, so meta-analysis refers to the quantitative study of published studies or even unpublished studies. It's like studies of studies, basically, for those of you who are less familiar with it. And in some ways, I think meta-analysis is more powerful than sort of basic research for at least one reason, maybe two reasons. One is it necessarily involves working with more cases than any single primary study can work with. So by definition, meta-analysis tends to be better powered than the primary studies that are used to compose it. The other advantage of this meta-analyses, of course, is that they're typically drawing upon samples from a variety of different places. So you get some heterogeneity in those analyses that you wouldn't necessarily get if you were just working with a primary sample. Having said that, there's this kind of joke that I guess comes from the computer sciences, garbage in, garbage out, right? So if you're taking a biased research literature and then meta-analyzing it, the answer you get is necessarily going to be biased also. So it doesn't solve all problems. It's not that kind of panacea. But I do value the results of meta-analysis more than the results of any single primary study for the most part. Now, how can you critically suss out a meta-analysis? You know, there's probably some good resources on that, and I couldn't tell you, I'm just gonna give you my own impressions off the top of my head, which are uneducated and biased in other kinds of ways. But I would say the more studies that are used in a meta-analysis, the better. The more diverse studies there are, the better. And probably the better the sample sizes and the measurement properties of all the individual studies feeding into it, the more trustworthy it is. One danger, I would say, with meta-analysis is because there's a tendency, at least in the social and behavioral sciences, to think in a binary way about research questions, like, is there a difference between these two groups, rather than what is the difference between these two groups? The results of just about every meta-analysis I've ever seen are, yes, there's some kind of difference. And people still don't know what to think about the magnitude of that difference. Now, that turns out to be something that Brent Roberts is going to talk about a little bit later today. But I view that as being one of the challenges for how we interpret meta-analysis. What do we use that information for? That's a problem for primary research studies too, but I think it becomes more clear in the context of meta-analysis because there, the measurement error typically fades away and you just end up with a number and now you don't know what to do with it.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm a PIO for a university, and one challenge that I encounter is that I'll talk with a researcher about their findings, which is based purely on some statistical calculation that they've done, and I have a very hard time translating that into findings that the average person can understand. So how do I describe what a p-value is? How do I describe what Cohen's ABC thing is, whatever that is? So as somebody who probably talks about this, do you have any recommendations on how we can take more statistical findings that, let's just assume that they're very relevant and exciting, and translate that for an audience that doesn't understand statistics, coming from somebody who also doesn't understand statistics, but you know, maybe I understand just a little bit more than the normal reader?
I have the perfect recommendation for you. And this is the perfect before lunch recommendation, or is it before break? Before coffee recommendation. This is almost exactly what Brent Roberts will be talking about later today. This time I'm not trying to just sort of dodge the question. I actually think he has some good answers to this question, so I think you're gonna love hearing his talk. As will I. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Chris. This is the before break time. We're going to start back at 10:25, and we're going to keep doing this teamwork. Data visualization's up next with a show from Donna Cox from the NCSA, and you certainly can't do that by yourself. So have some good coffee and some good conversation. We'll see you back at 10:25. Good morning. We're starting to back again. Places, everyone. This is now a production. I have something hot off the press for you. Our next speaker, it's been announced just this morning, is going to receive a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Association for Computing Machinery. It's not going to be really announced till August, but you have it first. That's right. Donna Cox is a recognized pioneer in scientific visualization, especially for public education and public outreach. She directs the Advanced Visualization Laboratory at the National Center for Supercomputing Applications at the University of Illinois. She's a professor in the School of Art and Design at the College of Fine and Applied Arts. She directs the Illinois Emerging Digital Research and Education in Arts Media Institute. Donna and her collaborators inspire viewers with cinematic virtual tours through astrophysics, earth sciences, engineering, and other data domains. The work appears in Digital Dome museum shows, high-definition documentary television programs, and IMAX movies. I present to you Professor Donna Cox.
Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be here. I've learned a lot in the last 24 hours. It makes me even nervous. Some of the things I'm going to show, I welcome you to challenge me about them. Let me skip this. I'm director of the Advanced Visualization Lab at the National Center for Supercomputing Applications, and I will show a slide of the members of that group because much of what I'm going to talk about today, data visualizations to reach mass audiences, is done by this team in collaboration with scientists. Now I'm going to narrow this focus to really, data visualization means a lot of things to a lot of people. So I'm going to focus on three-dimensional, spatial, and temporal numerical information for the inclusion in the context of non-fictional science narratives. So that's a slice, and it's pretty unique. I'm first going to talk about data visualization in the context of computational science and provide you some examples. I won't go into great detail. It's going to be a lot of visual imagery. Won't go into a lot of mathematics, but I'll take you a little bit through our process, show you some examples from some of the IMAX films and full dome shows, and then talk about data mapping and bias in data and in maps. First, I want to just talk about some different types of three-dimensional spatial visualization. Now, this is data that we have processed at the AVL, working with Larry DiGirolamo on campus. And what is very unique about this visualization is that we have pulled together many data sets from the Terra satellite, and it's loaded with multiple instruments to scan the Earth, like Aster gets height data and temperature data, and we get different types of data like carbon dioxide from MOPIT. So continually, satellites are going around our Earth, and they're sensing our Earth, and this is the type of data. But not even the NASA program managers really understood the context or how all of this data fit together until we did the integration and put it on the globe and showed them the relationship of the different data sets to one another. Now, before, that was observational data from satellites. This is computational data on the surface of a map, which is a digital map that's been worked on for many years. The blue marble, we spread it out and then put a data set from the Cypress Institute to study climate change. But the way that data is created is the scientists set up large systems of physics equations. They calculate these, they generate billions of numbers, and then we take that numerical data that's generated in a supercomputer by scientists solving physics equations, and we visualize that. So it's not observational, but we show the clouds, we show it on a map, and it looks fairly realistic. Now, this is totally a computational data set. It's not on a map of any sort. In fact, it's on the grid field of the original calculation. And what we have done is, over a period of a year, many years ago, worked with a team of scientists that had calculated the physics equations that had been provided, set up information from a real tornado to calculate this deterministic theoretical tornado, to study what were the features, what were the parameters that created this tornado in a thunderstorm. And then we took that numerical data as an interdisciplinary team of artists and technologists working with the scientists and represented that three-dimensional numerical information in the form of stream tubes to show the location of the geometry of the airflow. And I'll go into more detail about how we did this in the future. So computational science is that part of science where in supercomputers, one of the biggest, when this was built, it was one of the biggest supercomputers in the United States, Blue Waters on this campus, and it takes up a building, and the scientists set up systems of equations, and they compute these equations. And we've heard a lot about, and we get science and visualizations out of this supercomputer. Now, a lot of these are 2D, some of them are 3D. What we work on is primarily 3D. And what the Advanced Visualization Lab has done, and are very famous for actually, is the cinematic presentation of scientific data in the context and working with collaborative teams to tell stories. And we measure the outcomes from audiences, and we work with educators and writers, and we measure students and their interpretations, but we focus on just digitally data-driven images based upon vetted scientific data. And we've heard a lot about vetting and truth factor and the scientific process. But when these scientists as teams have this data, they're published in Science, they're published in the National Science Foundation. Often the work and the data is funded by the NSF. We use that type of data that's been pre-vetted and then interactively work with the science teams to make sure we represent it accurately as possible. And we take the care as artists and cinematographers and technologists to render that data in a cinematic form. Now, artists have been doing this for a long time. Up in the upper left, that artist, Don Dixon, worked with Carl Sagan on conceptual ideas around science that happened many years ago and are now being proven with new forms of observational science. So here's my team, left to right, Jeff Carpenter, me, Bob Patterson, Kalina Borkowitz, Stuart Levy, AJ Christensen. We work in stereo, so a lot of the things that you're going to see, you can come over and see them in stereo over at the NCSA, which is catty corner across the way here. I'm going to provide you what they call a teaser, a reel in the production industry. It's a sampler. It's not intended to communicate anything to you, but the kind and variety of visualizations that our team produces. So here it is. Call this our sizzle reel. And you can go to our website, and all the credits are there for the scientists who worked with us on each of those projects. So before I get into how we do some of this, I'm going to go into a little personal history of, that's captured in a book that I co-edited with Ellen Sandor and Janine Fraun, called New Media Futures, The Rise of Women in Digital Arts. And I focus on untold her stories in this book. And I'm not only an editor, but a contributor. And I just want to touch upon this because in the last 24 hours, we've heard about the bias of omission. And I'm going to come back and talk about that in a little more detail. The book has a long introduction that the editor said could have been a book in and of itself, going about to the 1800s about overlooked women in history in the Midwest. One of these women is Marion Mahoney Griffin, who really created the prairie-style architecture. She was an architect from Illinois, the first licensed architect. And all of her drawings and designs are often misattributed to Frank Lloyd Wright as the creator of the prairie style and the kinds of homes that are designed and that Chicago is famous for. Another little known fact is we are familiar with Jane Addams, but she invented the whole field of social science, which we benefit from today. Other things that we cover just in the introduction are the Rosies. How many people here saw Hidden Figures? You know, the movie. Overlooked women in history. In fact, there were 65 million women working during World War II. Our economy would have collapsed had there not been for women in the workforce. And a lot of that went unrecognized until the 60s and the women's movement. And the woman who kicked off the women's movement came from Peoria, Illinois, when she wrote The Feminine Mystique, which gave way to the movement during that era. And it was born in a small apartment in Chicago when women started writing a newsletter there. Some of the other overlooked histories are right here at the University of Illinois. We know about Mosaic. It's the first visual browser. It was a transformative technology invented at the National Center for Supercomputing Applications. But the designer who really laid this out and contextualized the visual part of this, which really made it a success, Colleen Bushell, never gets her due when we talk or hear about Mosaic. We only hear about Mark Andreessen in the news. So it's her personal story. We follow the introduction with interviews by 22 women, 2 of whom have passed away. But all of these women have claims to fame from the Midwest, being the first in digital games and virtual reality and medical software and morphing software. And we get to my own personal story, which is also in the book. Over a decade, we interviewed 22 women orally and captured their interviews. And it took us a decade to edit them and get their approval of them. So the introduction is followed by these personal stories. Mine is, that's me. My personal story is I started out in Enid, Oklahoma. My father died 4 months after I was born as a result of World War II. My mother was a widow, and she raised my brother and me with my grandmother, who was also a widow, on a farm in Oklahoma. My mother and grandmother worked traditional jobs to support the family, and were among the millions of women after World War II that were told to go back home and were paid lower salaries than the men returning from the war. I witnessed this, and I can tell you that personally, the women's movement during the 60s gave me a whole new world. I could see myself able to do things I could never see before. It was the possibility, it was the role models, it was the breaking away from those reinforced stories of where women should be. I'll skip ahead and jump to the fact that I was an early pioneer of computer art in a day that I was programming long before Photoshop, understood mathematics enough, and writing software at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I started working with scientists at that time and had the idea that the future of the convergence of art and science through computer graphics and technology, that's what I was going to do. And I came here to the University of Illinois in 1985, and the Supercomputing Center, NCSA, was just starting up. There's the Cray 1 hooked to a Mac 1 in 1985, and here was our founding director. Everybody had to have their beauty shot with the Cray, which was just over here, a couple of blocks away. I was an assistant professor in art and design, but I had this vision that I wanted to work in data. I wanted to work collaboratively with scientists, and I had my beauty shot with the Cray supercomputer also. That's 1988. And when I started working with scientists to transform and design numerical data and to come up with ways of representing that three-dimensional data that was time evolving, I began to realize that what we were doing was creating a visual language, empowering people to read numbers, doing it in time evolution. This is plastic injection molding that I worked with Rich Elson and at Kodak and designed the first three-dimensional glyphs in 1988 with 2 different color scalar maps to show that work. And in 1988 also got work collaboratively on the cover of Science News. And this was done right here. Michael Norman and the Astrophysical Jet and I created an image that was put on the cover of the NSF report that really led the way for visualization in scientific computing. And in 1986, we got this image into the SIGGRAPH electronic theater, which I'm going to show you. We got something into the SIGGRAPH Electronic Theater, this particular SIGGRAPH, and SIGGRAPH, it's the ACM SIGGRAPH that's giving me a Lifetime Achievement Award. Now, what I began to realize that I was working with data, and it's three-dimensional, and I started to realize that the context within which this data was being shown and the stories around it, this was the information superhighway that Bob Patterson and I did the first data visualization of the internet back in 1990, 1991, working right here in this building, and mapping it. Look at the bias here. You've only got the United States. That right away is a visual bias. And you've got these connections to other parts of the world because those people really wanted to get on the map. But I started realizing the context, the story, maps, and data, that this was a real challenge. And like Tina said, people are complicated. And we started working right here on the second floor of this building. We had the cave. We were taking data into the cave and virtually wayfaring through data, creating maps, flying through it with handheld devices. And this was as early as 1994. And in the process of doing this, I came to the realization that we were constructing reality out of numbers. We were constructing the universe, and that this information was not only reflecting our technological and material and social and political realities, it was telling us, just like these historical maps, who we are and what we are. And that it was not just a data visualization communication system, it had all the political biases and who's got the technology and what they're saying with it was powerful. And then I was influenced by Roger Ebert, who is from here in Champaign-Urbana, and the famous film critic. And this was at the beginning of Ebert Fest many years ago. That's me and Roger at the Illini Union when we used to have panels. But I was really impressed by the importance of story and empathy and the things we humans, when we're visually looking at numerical data, what that means. And then we got the opportunity to work on an IMAX film. This was 1996. I remember here I am, a little, associate professor in art and design, and I'm talking to Smithsonian scientists, and I'm showing them plots of dots on paper. And no, we can really make it 3D. We can really make it beautiful, and we want to show this. Because up to this point, all IMAX films were done with special effects. There was no data behind making the images. So at that point, we were setting a precedent. And the thing is what we learned is we didn't always have control of the script. So we had data, three-dimensional, vetted data, for Cosmic Voyage, like some of these other IMAX films, but we as a team, a visualization team, couldn't control, hey, this is a numerical simulation. It's not really two galaxies colliding. However, we forged ahead and we started to gain control. So I'll tell you about some of the projects that we have worked on in which we have co-produced. And then we have more influence on the script and the contextualization of these stories. But first, I want to say that this process of mapping numbers to visual elements is in of itself a challenge. And we have to vet our numbers and iteratively work with the scientists. We are coming up with ways of representing, like where the tornado is, And the stream tubes are colored by vertical velocity. We're coloring, we're using numerical ranges of colors just like you would see on a political map, just like you see colors, oh, the red and the blue and such. This is what we're doing here, and then we decide to show the wind speed by the length of the cones and the color of the cones on the ground plane by temperature. So this is all represented numbers that go into a three-dimensional form, but it gets very complex, and there's too much data, and there's a lot of decisions on the way. So in 2002, we did an experiment. And if you just look at this animated graph up there, the bar graph, people have come to read bar graphs. They understand them today. But this is actually the same data in classification with a different visual metaphor. So the colors that you see in that bar graph, which is being played back in real time, we talked a bunch of our constituents at the supercomputing conference in Baltimore to wear these tags to track them. Now today, people are getting tracked all the time with data. But then they had to actually wear RFID tags, and they had to volunteer their name and information and classify themselves what they were most interested in. And then we tracked them, and they were worried about, oh, am I going to be tracked to the bathroom? Am I going to be tracked to my hotel? No. When we only tracked them in the area of the conference. And then we played it back. But the choices of how the same data from that bar chart could be represented was, we thought we would make it fun. So we divided up the technical sessions, the keynote, the exhibition hall, by flowers. And the petals and scale of the flowers represent the different categories. And as the flowers grow, that's the number of people that go into that area. And what we saw immediately is, in a rough guess, people spent most of their time on the exhibition floor. Now, that's rough, but it is data. And the representation and the choices of colors, we're used to seeing a bar graph, not always animated like this over time, tracking people in real time. But this is just a different visual metaphor or visiphore for that particular data. So there are artistic as well as scientific choices on any data set that you see visualized. I don't care if it's 2D using Tableau or if it's three-dimensional like this, because you cannot get all the data, almost always, into the visual. And then the presentation of it is its own science at IEEE Viz. So we decided we wanted to make a story on dynamic Earth. And we couldn't get it funded. It talked about climate change and all the complex processes on the Earth that leads to the Earth warming, the rise in carbon dioxide, all the different processes. And we got Liam Neeson, the actor, celebrity, celebrity culture attraction to narrate it. We were going to co-produce it. We were going to make sure that we had control of the script, but we had no funding, but we had distributors and people who would work with us. So we did it on speculation to earn income after the fact through royalties, and Dynamic Earth has become one of the most popular full dome shows out there. It's even playing right now in Miami. So we took Dr. Wei Wang's data that you saw. She came to us from NCAR. That was the slice of data that we had seen. and we started putting it into 3 dimensions. So this is, this is 2-dimensional data. So a slice is being visualized on the surface of a map. This is 3-dimensional data. Now we're tracking it in the grid system. There's New Orleans, and we're trying to get it. But obviously, the hurricane is cut off at the edge. I don't know why, but scientists always compute in a box, and then we got to deal with the edges of the box. You know, it's like, okay, we got these limitations, right? But what we wanted to do as filmmakers is get down into the box to see the parameters and the data sets. So with our new virtual director system that's over in the other building now, we pre-visualize the Katrina data. And by the way, if these researchers, if FEMA had listened to these researchers about their computational model, there would not have been the disaster in New Orleans, but they did not have, they could not get through to the FEMA that the Katrina was really going to hit New Orleans like it did. So we wanted to visualize this, and this is how you choreograph using virtual director with a puck and fly through a small representation of the data to actually create a film. And there were a few sequences in the film, and we will show you a portion of a clip of that in a few minutes. Now, this was a co-production with the museum, so they had educators and people vetting the script. We had a science writer, we had a distributor, and we basically said, we'll bring in proceeds to the university after the fact, and it is still playing and still quite popular. And you will hear Liam Neeson talking about that this is a computational model. Domes are very popular. These huge domes are immersive environments that have projection systems where people sit in audiences, millions every year. They go inside them and they are immersed in the show. And so what we have started doing is making a lot of dome shows with computational data visualizations. This is the one at the California Academy of Science in San Francisco. Here's the American Museum of Natural History in New York City Dome. People go sit inside these, and they are surrounded by shows. And they often have celebrity narrators, and we have worked on a few of those. Well, a few years ago, the National Science Foundation funded us with a project to create data visualizations from scientific data that had been vetted and to provide a lot of scientists the opportunity to work with us and to expand the outreach opportunities for these data visualizations. So they would simply cover what we did in terms of data visualizations, but we brought to the table all of the museum directors and distributors and writers and educators, and what we got funding for that was really special was working with Dr. Lizanne DeStefano and measuring audiences and children and vetting the scripts and vetting how things were written ahead of time and the visuals and testing on those data visuals to see if they seemed accurate in what they were communicating. So we did a project narrated by Benedict Cumberbatch. We got him before he got really expensive. I don't know how Tom Lucas figured that one out. We can't afford him now. And this project was partially funded by Cadence, translated into 8 languages. And there's enormous amounts of data because so much of the data that we retrieved came not only from computational science, there was observational science. So like Jeff Carpenter worked taking observed solar flares from the NASA Solar Dynamics Observatory, visible light of these solar flares coming out of the sun. And solar superstorms is about these storms. What causes them and why should we care? And it makes it very clear we should care because solar superstorms bring down our satellite communications, bring down our power grids. And in fact, we're supposed to have a solar superstorm today, a mild one. So that was the crux around the research of forecasting solar superstorms and understanding all the research about the different parts of what creates these solar storms and these double coronal mass ejections. Here's sort of a mock-up in Virtual Director of the data. Notice it's jumping. We often work with the scientists to interpolate between the computations because they only write out a few time steps. And what we noticed is the scientists divide up the universe into their expertise. So while one researcher is looking at coronal mass ejections on the sun, another researcher, Matthias Rimpel, is looking at the surface of the sun and what's creating the sunspots on the surface of the sun. And he's doing this in the supercomputer, the virtual numerical laboratory, trying to figure out what prediction-wise, what is it on the surface of the sun that leads to these solar superstorms, creating these holes for the solar flares to come through. Then another researcher is inside the sun, calculating magnetic spheres and the surface and how it all goes back up through. And what we did was integrate these huge data sets into one continuous image to tell a story of how all this different research comes together to be coherent so that scientists know what they're talking about to a large extent. Robert Stein, we took some of his data. This is mocking it up in Virtual Director, and this is what it looks like after it's rendered. And we iterated with Bob Stein and all these scientists on colors, features, and when we had to sample or filter the data. So here is one narrated by Benedict on that scene that integrates the superficial data from NASA that shows the edge, and then we go into Matthias's surface, and we go underneath into hell with Bob Stein's magnetic fields. And so here it is. Turn it up a little bit. Thank you.
This computer model takes us just below the surface. As the magnetic field pushes through this hellish region, it forms immense rising arcs.
Can you hear it?
They become enveloped in electrical currents, the cloud-like features shown here. These currents, generated by rising and sinking streams of plasma, pump energy into the magnetic arcs. As the arcs stretch upward, they can draw huge volumes of hot plasma toward the surface.
Thank you, Seth. And so that is one excerpt from an entire show that's contextualized by live action, by talking about the effects on society that these have. They have brought down power grids because the solar storms hit certain parts of the equipment in our, like Illinois Power. If they know ahead of time, they can turn off the electricity and save their machines from getting blasted by the solar storm. Your cell phones, sometimes when they just don't work, those are often small solar flares. But in the story, we relate that in the 1800s, there was a Carrington event that's been well documented by scientists because these solar superstorms create the aurora borealis. And at that time, in the 1850s, the aurora borealis lit up to where at night looked like day. There was a 100-year solar superstorm. Well, we haven't had one of those since the 1850s. So we know that it just takes the Earth at just the right angle, a double coronal mass ejection, and then we have this protective shield that protects us most of the time, but sometimes stuff from these solar superstorms get in through the shield. And so it's important to be able to forecast these. This is not just space weather for the fun of it. So this is another excerpt. There are 10 in the solar superstorm show. I'm going to show you another one. Here we had the supercomputer's model simulation had no Earth. So we took artistic license in collaboration with the scientists that we would put an Earth there. But the magnetic fields and this storm coming in, all of these were calculated within Blue Water's supercomputer. And we dealt with a lot of data, but we iterated and posted movies and talked to the scientists over the telephone. So here's another excerpt of research by Homa Karamabadi.
To understand how a powerful solar storm can impact Earth, scientists have visualized its arrival in one of the largest solar computer models ever produced. The solar plasma is carried across space by streams of magnetic field, shown in blue. Our planet generates a magnetic field of its own that deflects most solar particles. In this case, pressure from the solar blast pushes this defensive shield closer to the Earth. On the leading edge, turbulence causes cracks to open up in the Earth's magnetic armor. The fissures widen. Millions of tons of electrified gas now surge through in jet-like flows that can engulf the planet. No one knows exactly why, but solar magnetic activity rises and falls in a cycle that lasts about 11 years. At the peak of this cycle, the sun can churn out as many as 3 coronal mass ejections in a day.
So we've come a long way since 1994 with Cosmic Voyage, where we had no script control. And with this, we were able to influence and say, you know, we don't know. There's certain things we don't know. Scientists don't know all the answers. They are not the high priests of everything. And I could never get in Cosmic Voyage them to even say, well, these are the best ideas that science has today. And Cosmic Voyage, the creationists wouldn't even look at it in the South during the time of that particular show. I mean, I've encouraged all the scientists I've worked with, please be more humble. There are a lot of assumptions behind this data. There are a lot of assumptions behind these numerical models. And one of the top researchers at this university, who's an affiliate at NCSA, Dr. Victoria Stodden, would say these models, you know, we have difficulty in verifying these huge numerical supercomputer models. That in itself is a science. But we know enough through observation, through experience, through Illinois Power Grid, there's evidence from the patterns that we as humans and nature provides us, natural phenomenon, that this is what we believe. And this is the story we're going to tell right now. But the script says it's the best known evidence that we have today. So I'm going to show you the trailer for this, which is sensational. People love disasters. So we gave them a disaster for the trailer, but it shows the live action involved in the Carrington event. That's primarily why I'm showing it. Oh, audio?
A fury is building on the surface of the sun. Jets of superhot gas. Rising waves of fire. The most violent explosions in our solar system. Journey into our star. To explore its inner workings.
Here's the live action with
and experience the power
an actor.
of solar superstorms.
You know, they don't have enough good writers for these shows. It's a field to consider. We've got our celebrity culture, got it all right here. So what happened was, NSF had a bill in 2016 to get funding for space weather because of this research. At the time, Congress thought that geoscience was all about climate change and decided to defund that division within the NSF. There were rumors and speaking of that because they didn't understand that geoscience was about hurricanes, tornadoes, space weather, all kinds of things. So NSF invited me to present the full version of solar superstorms at the Senate building in Washington, D.C., May 25th, 2016. The bill went forward. We talked to aides. Cray even served a free lunch. All the scientists came in who'd worked on solar superstorms and talked about evidence and talked about this research really did not need to be defunded, that we need to continue to understand and be able to forecast. And the bill passed the Senate within the week after this event and showing the movie. And within last year, it passed the House, and now we have funding for this particular effort, and NSF has been very happy about that. So, just to let you know, these stories, these film, the emotional content, the celebrity culture, all the scientist authority has impact. It has power. So what I worry about in my legacy is, well, who's going to get a hold of this? Who's got the money to fund this? Makes chills go up my back right now when I think about if these technologies and visual things are in the wrong hands. Well, AVL has won a lot of awards. These shows have gone a lot of places. Millions of people have heard them all over the globe. And one of the big award winners is Hubble 3D. And just last October, we had at the Ebert inaugural symposium, we had the director of this film with whom we'd worked. She was here along with Chaz Ebert, and we had a big symposium on the topic of data visualization and movie making. And we got into some of these issues around truth and data. Brent Houston from the College of Media was there and gave talks. We had Carrie Karahalios from the computer science talking about algorithms and the issues around data and algorithms. But I first want to just tell you about Hubble 3D. So most of the film is filmed by astronauts up in space repairing the Hubble Space Telescope. And we did about 25% of the film in data-driven virtual tours to show people why bother to repair that mirror. And we worked with the Space Telescope Science Institute. Hubble imagery comes back because it's optical type of imagery, comes back in these 2D photographs. But to make them three-dimensional or two-dimensional spatially, we work with the scientists who studied this and studied the frequencies and divide up the nebula into the areas that need to be registered in 3D and use computer graphics technology to move that three-dimensional mesh according to those data frequencies in collaboration with the scientists. Now, we chose the Orion Nebula. That was the director's choice because Toni Myers, had done Blue Planet. She's done all the space films with all the astronauts. She came here and visited 3 times to choreograph with Bob Patterson and Stuart Levy and the rest, and A.J. Christensen and Kalina and Jeff, and we worked together to choreograph through the Hubble data. And the director had chosen Hubble because, or not Hubble, but Orion Nebula, because it's the most studied nebula and the closest to us in the history of humanity, dating back to the Mayans and Egyptians. Even popular television shows study Orion. It's close. And so we chose that to do a lot of work on it in a period of 6 months. And you're going to see, along with Liam Neeson in The Hurricane, you'll see a clip narrated by Leonardo DiCaprio, which that's the clip that I'll have to tell Andrew to turn off because we don't have permission to stream his voice. We did not have control of the script because it was funded in part by Warner Brothers. And they had committees, and there were certain things that we didn't want them to say, like you'll hear Leonardo say, "This is real star travel." No, it's not. It's a digital data, but it's Leonardo. So we had no control over this script, but it was the most amazing experience to take that three-dimensional data and show it for the first time to audiences ever, had never seen it in 3 dimensions like that before. We worked to bring that to the public because we can justify that our data visualizations were the best science that we know today, even though we couldn't control the script. And that is one of those trade-offs that you make that Tina was talking about just earlier this morning. So then we worked with the same director on A Beautiful Planet, narrated by Jennifer Lawrence and already circulating, and that was played at the IMAX Theater here in Savoy in October when the director and the astronaut visited, and we had the Ebert inaugural symposium. And the astronaut talked about filming all of using the IMAX film. Tony Myers, the director, has trained over 155 astronauts in how to film in space. And unfortunately, Tony passed away a few months ago. Unfortunately, she got some bad news not too long after she was here in October. But it was a wonderful experience. But even she lost control of a lot of what was being shown. She had done Blue Planet 20 years earlier, and she could see from the International Space Station the devastation, the real devastation that human beings are having up on the Earth. So she wanted to show it, but it wasn't a popular subject with the funders of that project. But she stood her own, and as best she can, because I've heard these questions, when you get into these ethical struggles that make or break your career, or make or break your job, or your no more funding, these are really deep growth, personal, human experiences. And we all, like Tina said, we all make choices. So here I'm going to show you a clip, and you can't record this, not the visual or the audio. The Hubble 3D, just a small clip narrated by Leonardo where he starts out, this is real star travel. And then a clip from Benedict, from Liam Neeson, Dynamic Earth, and Jennifer Lawrence. So you got recording off? recently just finished the second Cadence Digital Dome show that was premiered in Zeiss Gross Planetarium in Berlin a few weeks ago. And it's called The Birth of Planet Earth. We take people, again, through a lot of computational science, but also collaborate with Dr. Lizanne DiStefano, vetting and Christine Shanuda from this campus here, and Dr. DiStefano from Georgia Tech, vetting scripts, scientists vetting scripts, testing audiences. We tested in Tellus Museum after we had tested here at Sterkel. In fact, how many people saw solar superstorms or dynamic Earth when it was playing out at Parkland at the Sterkel Planetarium? One person. You're missing these great shows. They're right out here. We have our own digital small dome theater, but it still has all the content. And here we are out at Sterkel. We have a great relationship with David Leake, who runs that program, and we tested audiences with a rough cut of the script and got feedback. One person really hated it, said it was way over their heads. But then we turned around, modified the script. I mean, it was complex, and we got information back from Melly Senior, who's sitting in the audience. We changed things, and then it went back to Tellus Museum and Dr. Lizanne DiStefano, and I saw her a few weeks ago, and she said, you would be amazed. Here you're taking people from the formation of the Earth and taking them all the way down to photosynthesis and the creation of life on Earth. And the young people got it. Now, I have a feeling we'll lose some people, but here is the collision that formed the moon and the birth of planet Earth in the rough cut with the rough cut voice. And then I'm going to play you the next piece on photosynthesis with Richard Dormer, who narrates it. So here we go.
A computer model gives us a view of the first 24 hours. Thea shears about a third of Earth away. Its shattered remains envelop Earth in a dense atmosphere of superheated vaporized rock. A molten ring forms around our planet, subjecting it to a rain of secondary impacts. Within only a century, this orbiting cloud will cool and coalesce into a single orbiting body, the Moon. The violence of the Moon's formation leaves Earth spinning rapidly on a slightly tilted axis. A day lasts only about 5 hours.
So that is not the absolute final. You can always tell because if you've got, file numbers and frame numbers. And the scientist we worked with, a woman, Dr. Robin Knupp, was so dynamic. And for all the Cadence projects, you can go online to the website at Cadence at the NCSA, National Center for Supercomputing Application, and see the making of, so that we have in-depth interviews with the scientists to talk about the science. And she's very dynamic. And she talks about getting moon rocks or getting rocks from these explorations and how that feeds into the numerical models that are calculated in supercomputers. And that, I mean, this is fairly recent news. We don't know which numerical model is going to come out, but the idea that it really was a collision of the Earth and moon, and that without the moon, we wouldn't have life on Earth as we know it today. That's fairly recent news in science, and there's a lot of people working on it, and they're either fighting about their numerical models, and I shouldn't say fighting, but you know, they're debating their approaches. But it's starting to become accepted because of moon rocks. And so the next piece is done in collaboration with John Stone, Melly Senior, Barry Israelowitz, right here at the Beckman in the late Klaus Schulten's research group. And I am going to play it, and I just want to mention that this is the final narrator. Who all knows who Richard Dormer is? Thank goodness. So anyway, I'm not even going to go any further than that. So what he is narrating this piece, and you know, Benedict sounded so great. You know, he's from Britain. He has the. So anyway, Richard is narrating this piece, and I am interested in seeing your input on that. Also, this piece has just been accepted into the ACM SIGGRAPH Electronic Theater. There are thousands of entries, so it's very much of an honor for, and we will put on it in memory of Klaus Schulten. And the whole birth of planet Earth was dedicated to the memory of Klaus Schulten, because we started working with him and his team at the beginning of the project. And that collaboration with the writer changed the story of Birth of Planet Earth. It was the passion of Klaus and his team explaining photosynthesis and the ideas behind it. And so the writer, Tom Lucas, looked into more information, was impacted by that, and the story around the birth of planet Earth really changed based upon this collaboration with this biophysics team here at Beckman. So I'm going to play this piece, and it's been accepted, and we have some modifications to do, but here it is as it is.
Photosynthesis, the process that fuels plant life, made its first appearance in simple bacteria over 3 billion years ago. Using one of the world's most powerful supercomputers, scientists have sought to model its chemical secrets. Step 1 is to capture sunlight. Passing through a transparent membrane to the center of the bacteria, we encounter a cluster of spherical pods. Each one is equipped with special sensors designed to harvest solar energy. When a photon hits, it excites rings of chlorophyll molecules. This energy is transferred across a family of proteins, the machines of life. Down the line, electrons and protons carry the energy through a chain of chemical reactions. The energy driving these reactions came from the sun. The cell must now convert it into action. It's the energy stored in protons that gets things moving. Streaming into watery spaces within the cell, they flow toward a towering molecular structure. As they enter, their electrical charges turn a protein like a crank. This turning motion initiates a chemical reaction, one that is essential to all life on Earth. Two molecules join to form a third, called ATP, shown in blue. It is the universal energy currency in every cell that has ever lived. Like a biological battery, ATP stores energy captured from the sun, repackaged in a stable form that the cell can now use. To break down food, to power locomotion, to fuel reproduction, to live. ATP made it possible for microorganisms to flourish and evolve.
So that's complex. Now, I didn't talk enough about audiences, but from the very beginning, from Cosmic Voyage all the way through Dynamic Earth, we had to gauge who our audiences were to talk to the audience. For these museum shows and IMAX films, the audience are the general public. That means they can be 8 years old or 80 years old. Museums like California Academy of Science and New York Museum of Natural History target audiences that will come as children. They then they become parents and bring their children, and then they bring the grandparents, and then the grandparents bring the grandchildren. That's their audience. So having language this complex is a risk. And not all of the show has language this complex. Melly, raise your hand. If anybody has a question about that piece, you talk to that man over there. Because I don't know that, I get it all, but I do know that it's set up, the whole show is for repeat audiences. And that's how museums and IMAX films are made. They're dense with information so that people can come again and again and see them and get more information each time, and to understand the content. Now I want to come back to Roger Ebert quote, because in making these films, I have to express that I have a bias. I can tell you that I have sat with scientists since 1988, and I believe in climate change. And I want to communicate aspects of that in various ways. And I'm leaving with Bob Patterson to go to Aspen Institute on a climate change conference on Friday, day after tomorrow, I think, or 2 days away. And I believe that some of these, everything works together. You've got the narrator, you've got the music, the symphony, you've got voices of authority. Most of our pieces, like Seeing the Beginning of Time, we have female narrators because we need to hear more women narrating to become a voice of authority for science. But also the music is very key to really understanding our emotional content. And when Roger Ebert talked about the movies are like machines that generate empathy. That's what we talked about in our inaugural symposium, is how this works together with our knowledge to create a kind of empathy for, in this case, for what we're doing this weekend in Aspen for Dynamic Earth. It really is about creating empathy for planet Earth and the understanding for the planet. So we put together, I'm just going to close with this, this piece, if I've got time. Let's see, I've got about 10 more minutes of stuff. Is that okay? Yeah, you've got plenty of time. Okay. So I'm going to play this piece, and I want you to listen to the music. So the music is important to the piece. But basically, the audience for this next piece is people from funding agency. It's a piece that accompanies a proposal to do more work on visualizing the Earth. It's a piece that captures what we've done in the past to show what's happened. So, but the difference between a narrated piece and one with just music, I want you to listen to, because the work that we're doing in Aspen is taking data-driven visualizations and providing the opening and closing for a performance piece of artists and filmmakers coming together on climate change, and the scientists are there too. But first, what we do sometimes is repurpose our data-driven visualizations for the purpose of performance in art. The purpose on Saturday at the Earth's Call is to create empathy. And I can't show you that because we're under contract, and I can't show you that piece that's being mapped onto sails in the tent and a big screen, bigger than this. It's an audience experience, and I can't show that to you now. But I'm going to show you something that we created for funding agencies to be able to try to get money for our planet Earth and to show our expertise for funding, just being able to see observed data. So here it is. It is a visualization excerpts, and then we're almost done. Turn it up a little bit. in closing, I just want to say that there's a lot of technologies out there that, and I also want to give credit especially to Jeff Carpenter and Bob Patterson for pulling that little piece together and the music. So I have a student, a graduate student, working on virtual reality with the Cypress Institute and doing interesting collaborations on augmented reality and virtual reality, taking people into the map of an area right in Nicosia, right between the Cypriots and the Turks, and that have been in war for many, many years. And they're trying to preserve the archaeological site by creating a map, and the demilitarized zone is right through there with the UN. And it is, I've been learning from my student the importance of who controls this environment, who controls these maps, and how people really see themselves historically and within current day with regard to that map that's being virtually created, and the people who own the technology and everything will write that history and create that history within these digital maps. Maps are very important, and we're creating digital maps around us of data all the time. And they foster the construction of our own collective identities as countries, as states, as political parties, as our histories. They segregate us according to land and interests. And we need to have more accountability and ethics in the innovation around these topics. Everybody wants to be on the map. And the camera paths even show the eye of the beholder's bias on Urbana, Illinois, starting out right here, where the big glyph, Global Lambda Integrated Facility Map, all these are hot research connections. We're still doing maps like this many years later. But these maps serve a purpose, and they're visually profound. And everybody, when we started out and did this first map, nobody was out here. They saw the United States. They wanted to be on the map. Nobody wants to be left out. So, but the Indians were left out. The Native Americans were left out. When Lewis and Clark expeditions went across the United States, it was almost a deliberate attempt not to map the Native American tribes. And it looked like it was a free-for-all for settlers to go in. Those expedition maps fostered misinformation that people live with even today. They reveal, if you look at maps, they reveal our historical confirmation biases visually and historically. And there's a great book out I suggest all of you read by Virginia Eubanks about automating inequality, how high-tech tools, profiling, and they punish the poor. She's got great research on unintended consequences of our data, of our lack of inclusion of data, of issues around algorithms that get out of control. Because I can tell you, social data is much more complex than astrophysics. Data and algorithmic accountability and ethics in what we do should be just like this conference, the top topic. And I am so glad to be here and to be a part of this. And I've lived it all my life, and I've seen it in others. We want to have inclusivity because it really does tell the full story. And that our cognitive bias, which I learned from Dr. Cook, and our confirmation bias is there all the time when we only feature men, or we only feature certain things in the data. And it has ramifications on us individually and as human beings. And so with that, I'm out of time, and I will close, and I will take questions. Thank you very much. Yes. Back there?
What a beautiful presentation. Thank you for this treat. Just another note I'd like to make is to quote Albert Einstein. He said, if you knew what you're doing, it wouldn't be called research. And the last point I'd like to make is that there's a big growing push from federal funding agencies to do better and better evaluation. So what can the research community do to improve the reliability of the data that we are portraying to the public?
My biggest, I don't have the answer. What I have is a description of what I've observed. And I worry about the algorithms, especially in machine learning, that are already programming in our biases as human beings around diversity and inclusion, and that we're inputting them into these complicated algorithms that have form neural nets, and eventually AI will make decisions, and they can't even debug some of these codes. That's my biggest fear. Data, at least if you gather it, some of the dialogue in the last 48 hours are great suggestions on how to observe and double check. The best part of science is that we have a revisionistic process. All science is up for revision. And so we can check that when we can see the numbers, or at least see the provenance of those numbers, and look back and see where did they come from. You got to take human beings to do that. But with automated algorithms that we all get, even through our social media, through the future of driving cars, those are the things that will be very difficult. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of lines of code in neural nets that human beings may not be able to find where the bias is, where is the lossless data. So I think we need to move up front a force in the ethics in innovation, and a force in exactly what's happening here is part of what is the most important thing we can do. And then take teams of people from the University of Illinois to the funding agencies, and also inform them of priorities around ethics, inclusivity, and accountability. Virginia Eubanks talked about in her book, I saw her present over at the Illinois Program for Research in the Humanities a few months ago. And she talked about unintended consequences of, let's say, a medical hospital outsources to a company to deal with the data of the Medicaid patients. Something goes awry. Somebody dies. Somebody did die. Who was accountable? The company had already signed an agreement with the hospital that they're not accountable, and yet it was their bugs and their softwares that led to the death of a human being. Who's accountable? So accountability, ethics, keeping these up front in our consciousness, just like we have done here today, is important, and we need many more conferences like this. Okay?
You do have a little more time, and I want to ask you something in a different vein. It's about chutzpah.
Chutzpah, yeah.
You have a lot of it. And I remember when we were talking about this presentation, and you were talking about all these celebrities that you worked with, and I was like, well, you know, the science writers in the room probably don't have access to Leonardo and Benedict. And you were like, they shouldn't assume that.
Right.
Can you say more about that?
So, you know, part of it is just asking and finding the right team. We couldn't have done all this if we hadn't expanded our visualization team. We had to go out and develop relationships with people that had the money and contacts with the Benedicts and Leonardos. Being creative about these relationships. You're not alone. And so finding team members. So it was some work to go and develop new relationships around a lot of these projects. And to realize that when Warner Brothers or Touchstone Films are in control, you may have to give up control. So there's always trade-offs, always trade-offs. And then we come back to that individually, where is our own humanity and our own ethics? And I think that has been touched upon today and yesterday, and it's something that, believe me, we will grapple with the rest of our lives.
Thank you, Donna.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Donna. It's lunchtime. Let me just remind you that the tables in the atrium with the reserve sign are reserved for you. So you may eat in the atrium, you may eat in the room across the hall, and haven't been outside. And if the weather allows, there are some really nice tables outside too. Enjoy your lunch. Please come back at 1. We'll start at 1:05 with This Podcast Will Kill You, so be careful what you eat.